Who is the greatest king or emperor of the medieval period? Is it Charlemagne or Otto the Great? Is it Justinian or William the Conqueror? Is it Alfred the Great or Alexios I? Or is it Henry V because he got a Shakespeare? Or is it Baldwin IV because he was in Kingdom of Heaven? That is essentially the question that me and my two special guests will be answering today as we rank the 20 greatest medieval kings or emperors on an S to D scale. My name is Michael, and I run Memory Medieval, which is an upcoming podcast that will feature deep dives into historical figures of medieval Europe. And if you want to see that, as well as more videos like this, or perhaps you'd like to check out the audiobook that I recorded on dueling, Yes to the Death, you can subscribe here and check those out on the channel. And you can find more frequent content and updates at my X account at Memory Medieval. So let's get into the rankings. And first, we'll start by introducing and bringing in our two special guests. And today with me, I have David of Empire Builders. If you're coming here from YouTube, you've probably seen his videos. They are fantastic. Would highly recommend that you check out. It'll be linked in the description below his videos. And if there's any other things that you have going on that you want to promote, go ahead now, David.
No, that's about it. I cover a lot of medieval history. That's kind of how I got into history in the first place as a kid. But that being said, I have covered Bronze Age history. Right now, I'm focusing a bit on Roman history, a little bit of modern history as well.
And also today we have with us if you're coming here from Twitter, you've probably seen his excellent posts and exceptionally excellent threads, Medieval Scholar. And you can find the link for his, I said Twitter, but X, let's call it X. You can find the link to his X account below. And I would recommend checking him out. He actually just released an awesome thread on the First Crusades. I believe it was yesterday or the day before. Excellent work. And if there's anything else that you would like to talk about what you're working on or promote, go ahead, Medieval Scholar.
Thank you for having me. All I would like to say, as far as keep an eye open, I have a series planned on you. If you're a longtime follower of me, you may have seen my previous work where I did the dynasties of the Holy Roman Empire. If you're aware of that, then you may end up liking this series I have planned, which will cover the most notable, famous, powerful, and noble families of medieval France.
Awesome. So you can find the link for his X account down below. Be sure to go follow him and look for that. Now, today we're going to be ranking the 20 greatest medieval kings. Now, I need to talk a little bit about the methodology because I know there's probably going to be some complaints. I got some complaints already just from posting the picture on X. And so the methodology here was that I have submitted 6 entries for the top 20. David and Medieval Scholar have each submitted 7. So theoretically, there could be some king who would have been top 10 in the medieval ages, and somehow just through luck of the draw, the way of the methodology, just missed out. So I just want to put it out there. There could be some that are missing, and we may have to do a follow-up. Maybe we have to do like 50, at a later date when we're older and much more experienced. Also, let's talk a little bit about how we're going to be thinking about the best king in the Middle Ages or in the medieval period. And I'll start first. There's a couple things. Of course, when you're thinking about a king, you're thinking about leadership or generalship or taking care of their people, representing their people, advancing their particular kingdom's interests, representing their kingdom's interests, and sort of their reciprocal responsibility then with their vassals or with their people. So those things are kind of standard. A couple things that I'm taking into consideration for my own personal way of thinking about this is, number one, would I have wanted to live in their kingdom? Would I have wanted to live in their time? Now, this doesn't mean necessarily, of course, there's various kings who had various levels of stability or instability. But would this king, would I have considered this living under this king to be, I don't know, good enough? If I was a peasant, if I was a normal merchant or something like that, was life good for their subjects generally? And thinking about it through that rubric. Another way of that I think about it is, I feel like to really be a great king really had to calibrate himself to the situation, meaning that if the situation calls for him to be brutal in a particular way, then you have to be brutal. If it calls for you to be wise in a particular way, then you're able to be wise. There's somewhat of an analogy with baseball that I think of, where I've heard that if you can, if for pitchers in the game of baseball, if you can, if a pitcher has one good pitch, then they're like they can be a starter or something. If they have two good pitches, then they'll be a regular pitcher, and if they have three good pitches, then that's considered like to be an ace. And so I think about it in terms of kings, like being able to calibrate to particular levels, because there's some kings that they had to win their kingdom. There's some kings that maybe they inherited something and they're able to expand it. And you have to sort of be able to change gears and do things in particular modes for whichever the circumstance is. Somebody like, and we'll talk about this when we go on, but somebody like Robert the Bruce, who has to fight for his ability to be king, is different than somebody like Charlemagne, who inherits a kingdom with his brother. So you have to be able to change gears and do different things. And so I think to be truly great are those kings who can sort of change gears as is necessary to grow the kingdom, or to fight for the kingdom, or to choose the right kingly mode for the situation as desired. So those are kind of two of the big qualifications that I was considering when putting together my 6 nominations. And I guess, David, you can go ahead and go next.
Sure. So yeah, I kind of just went with people I found interesting, people I know a thing or two about. And I think we have some big hitters in there, though. We have some, I think we have some like paradigm setters in a variety of geographies. So that's kind of how I put forth my 7. We have representation in Germany, in modern day Greece, and the Byzantine Empire. Also by virtue of Germany, because a lot of the Holy Roman Emperors were ruling Italy as well. And then we have somebody from France and somebody from France/England.
Yes, and I will also say I chose Charlemagne and Alfred because I feel like those are 2 very common ones that just sort of have to be on the list. And so that way you guys could maybe make some more interesting choices. So I'm really looking forward to that. So, Medieval Scholar, why don't you tell us a little bit about sort of the criteria around your selections?
Yeah, so I tried to pick rulers that either, well, like what David said, mainly characters throughout history that have piqued my interest either recently or throughout the years. But especially the people who I picked were either people who, like you previously mentioned, they fought for their kingdom, they may have inherited it, and they may have waged wars on their enemies that may have threatened the sovereignty of their dominion. They may have inherited like someone like Edward IV, who became king during England, one of England's most tumultuous periods of time. Or you could have someone like Godfrey, who, throughout his determination and his relentless campaign in the First Crusade, led to him being the first ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So there's a lot of different avenues that the people who I picked ended up on this list, but many of them got here through both especially military but also cultural influence.
All right. So we'll go ahead, we'll jump in here and kick it off. So we're starting with Otto the Great.
Okay, so I'll say a little bit about him, I guess. He ruled in the 10th century. He was ruling at a time when East Francia was becoming Germany. He also restores the Holy Roman Empire, as I'll soon cover. very briefly. He's the son of Henry the Fowler, who's a very accomplished ruler himself. So the way I think about them two is kind of like Philip of Macedon and Alexander the Great. Otto the Great ends up becoming great and surpassing his father, but his father very much laid the foundations for him. They're a Saxon family, and Saxony is that's an interesting thing because Saxony is one of the last additions to the Frankish sphere of influence. Very hard to Charlemagne fights numerous wars there, very hard to put down Saxon resistance. But then they end up restoring his empire. What's interesting about this time as well, East Francia is becoming Germany, but also the imperial title has lapsed, and you have your last two barbaric incursions into Europe in the form of the Magyars or Hungarians and the Vikings. A little bit about Otto the Great. Since I'm guessing most people know a little bit about him, so I think it's interesting to get to know the man a little bit. Wittikind of Corvey, contemporary chronicler, describes him as having a sunburned face, but one that shone with light and lively eyes. Sparse gray hair covered his head and his beard after the Saxon manner, and billowed his hair long and mighty over his chest, which was very hairy like a lion's mane. He wore Saxon dress and shunned foreign splendor. He spoke his native Saxon tongue, but had some knowledge of Roman and Slavic speech. He slept sparingly, and as he talked in his sleep, seemed always awake. So it's a bit like Charlemagne. Simple, soldierly, hairy, very energetic, sleepless. This is a conscious evocation, I think. Liutprand of Cremona, he's another chronicler. He adds that Otto is a lover of truth, detests wiles, is compassionate when compassion is proper, but severe when severity is called for, like we talked about. Truly humble, never avaricious. So ultimately, I think he's an S tier. He's the guy who prevented the Hungarians from carving out a kingdom in Germany with Byzantine support. He paves the way for their entry into Christendom. He has a great battle to his name. He has Lechfeld in 955, which, per the historian Tom Holland, seems to have inspired Tolkien. And he also defeats a couple of big rebellions during his reign and goes on an absolute title revocation tear. Like, of all the early Holy Roman emperors, no one revokes more titles than him. He revokes 27. Charlemagne only ever revoked 10. It's crazy how much centralization happens under his reign, and it's all because everybody was rebelling. But ultimately, his father must get credit for laying the foundations for him. So, again, the way I think about them is Philip of Macedon and Alexander the Great.
So, one thing I forgot to explain for the viewers, we have all the tiers here. So, obviously, we're talking about great kings. Everybody can't be S tier. So, I think about it, we're going to use C as like the average tier. Obviously, D would be below average, which, I suppose you could still be great and be below average amongst all the great kings. B would be above average. A, I think, would be exceptional. And S tier is like a generational talent. So, or a generational man. Does that seem adequate for Otto the Great here?
I think so, but I just gave my spiel, so maybe
Sure,
I should
yeah.
let you guys go.
What do you think, medieval scholar?
Yeah, as someone who is overall a fan of the Holy Roman Empire and especially its early years, it's hard to deny really any of the accomplishments that Otto the Great had in, laying the groundwork and his military campaigns and his various effects on the outcome of how history would play out, especially for the Holy Roman Empire and how later rules would come to happen. People like Charlemagne, people like Frederick, these people and their times as rulers would likely not be anywhere remotely close to the same if it was not for the work that Otto did while he was alive.
All right. S tier it is then. So then next we have Philip Augustus. So take it away, medieval scholar.
It's going to be, it's going to be a good list when you're starting out with two heavy hitters. So Philip Augustus, also known as Philip II, who's king of France from the years 1180 to 1223. The predecessors before him on the throne were known as King of the Franks. But from 1190 going forward, Philip was the first French monarch to refer to himself as the King of France. So Philip was incredibly important to how the history of France would play out. He was given the epithet Augustus, which is something that you really wouldn't, it's something you don't expect to hear for a medieval ruler. He was given the epithet Augustus for his extending of the crown lands of France so heavily. He's most known for his conflicts with the House of Plantagenet, especially with his crushing victory that he had at the Battle of Bouillon in 1214 against King John of England and the Holy Roman Empire. He also was involved with the Albigensian Crusade against the heretical Cathars in the Languedoc in France, though not directly involved. He had his knights and his vassals carry it out. Philip was an incredibly important person. He transformed. If we would not have France as it is today without the actions that Philip conducted, he conquered much of Normandy and took the lands back for his kingdom. And he built, it's funny considering the recent presidential election, Philip built a massive wall around Paris. The wall of Philip Augustus. He conducted reorganizations of the French government, and he brought incredible financial stability to France. So I'm gonna have to give him an S tier.
As I'm always Richard the Lionheart maxing. That's
I know putting Philip in S tier as a Richard the Lionheart fan was really gonna put some pain in your chest.
Yeah, it's particularly salting, but it's hard to argue against his accomplishments. In particular, bringing the Angevin Empire or the House of Plantagenet to what probably is its demise.
It should also be noted that during the Battle of Bouillon, that Philip fought in the vanguard, so he was there.
What do you think, David?
I think that definitely gets some points, fighting in the van. As a Holy Roma boo, I also like that he was good chums with Frederick II. He sends him after the Battle of Bouillon, I believe, the standard of the Welf Emperor Otto IV, who Frederick II is obviously vying for control against. I think it's interesting that he also changes the titular, the titular change that happens under his reign from King of Franks to King of France. Kind of reminds me of Napoleon later bringing back, Emperor of the French, not Emperor of France, right? But I think kind of it also reminds me of what's happening in Germany, that basically these chunks of Charlemagne's empire are ossifying and like we're resigning themselves to the fact that Charlemagne's empire is not going to be entirely reunited. So yeah, I guess Philip Augustus is part of that process. Is he S tier? I don't know that I know enough about him, but he does seem pretty important. At least A tier.
All right. Well, we got our first real decision here.
Sounds like you'll have to be the tiebreaker, the
yeah,
Richard the
wow.
Lionheart pillar.
Wow. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm gonna strike a posthumous blow for Richard the Lionheart.
Wow.
Then wow. Down into A tier. Yeah. Richard's my guy. So
France will remember that.
Well, bring it on, France. All right. So next up, Charlemagne.
Enough said, right?
Yeah, really. And and for anyone who's not familiar, you should go watch David's video on Empire Builders of the
Thank you.
entire history of the Merovingians and the Carolingians. Fantastic video series. What can you really say about Charlemagne? He basically expanded the kingdom of the Franks. He became the Holy Roman Emperor, was essentially undefeated in battle, started the Carolingian Renaissance, which was a whole new era in learning and scholarship. I believe there was something like 90,000 manuscripts that were written in his court during that time, different books and other studies and things like that. So he really kicked off a new era of learning. He expanded on what he had received from his father. And I do think it's really interesting to consider how this is certainly not a knock on Charlemagne, but it's interesting that if things he really was the beneficiary, which he made the most of two incredible feats of fortune, I suppose you could say, because his father had the kingdom. So his grandfather was Charles Martel, who then had two sons, Carloman and Pepin. Pepin was Charlemagne's father, and Carloman, his uncle, died, if I recall correctly, which then led his father to acquire the entire kingdom and then expand it. And then the kingdom was divided between Charlemagne and his brother, Carloman. There's maybe a lesson here. Don't name your son Carloman. But anyway, it was between the two of them. And then Charlemagne's brother, Carloman, decided that he was very pious and was going to go be a monk. And so Charlemagne inherited essentially the entire kingdom when his brother retired to a monastery. So
I think I think that was the his uncle who did that. I think his brother Carloman died of a nosebleed.
Oh, did I get him backwards?
I think so. Yeah, I think his brother
Okay.
Carloman dies of a nosebleed. One of the
Okay.
most consequential in history, right? With
Yeah,
the Attila the Hun.
Yeah.
With Attila the Hun.
Even more
But-
reason not to name someone Carloman. You don't want them to
Yeah.
die of a nosebleed.
That's not great. Not a great look.
But it's almost crazy to consider that then if I guess his uncle doesn't retire to a monastery and the kingdom stays split, and then his inheritance is then split amongst his brother, he could have easily started with really like a quarter of the.
And that's the story of his successors, right? Actually, then Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, is also lucky that basically all his brothers die. All his legitimate brothers. Charlemagne was prolific. He had a lot of illegitimate children, but all his legitimate brothers die. So Louis the Pious inherits everything. But then you start to see the division and gradually the ossification, like we talked about already.
Yeah, really, really interesting. Also, an interesting note about Charlemagne that I recall hearing is that he couldn't read, so he liked to have books read to him or
Audiobook guy.
manuscripts and things. Yeah, total audiobook guy. But he also loved to swim, so he would have his courtiers read to him while he was swimming.
Yeah, he tried very hard to learn how to read and write, and he has these clay tablets by his bedside, and he's very restless. So sometimes he's scrawling on them at night. But he's not very literate. Safe to say.
I think it's safe to put Charlemagne at the top of the S tier. But if you guys have any input on that,
no.
The grandfather of Europe. Yeah, it's. But anyway, if anybody has any objections, now's your time.
No, I don't think there's any reason to put Charlemagne anywhere below S. If there was an S plus tier, Charlemagne would probably be there.
Yep.
All right, so there we go. So next up we have Otto III.
Okay, so he is ruling also in the 10th century toward the end, but he presides over the turn of the millennium, which is a very eschatologically angsty time. People think the world's going to end. He doesn't rule for a long time. So he inherits 983. There's a regency until 991, and he dies in 1002. It's a very short reign. He dies at 21. But there is a biography written about him from Gerrit Althoff, great book, and it's published in 2002. So that right away tells you, given the rarity of 21st century biographies on medieval rulers, that there's something to this guy. He's the son of Otto II, which makes him the grandson of Otto the Great. Otto II was this very kind of fiery figure, red hair, temper. But then on his mother's side, Otto III also has a remarkable heritage. His mom is Theophanu, who is the niece, we think she's the niece of the Byzantine Emperor John Tzimiskes. So this was the much-awaited Greek bride that every ruler from Charlemagne to Otto the Great was trying to wrangle for their dynasty. And they finally got it. She's kind of a second-rate princess, but she's still a Byzantine princess. And Otto III was very conscious of this dual heritage right from the start. He's half Greek, half Saxon. And he was a bit of a child prodigy. So they start calling him Mirabilia Mundi, wonder of the world. And he gets a world-class education from, among other people, Pope Sylvester II. He gets crowned emperor very early in his reign, which allows him to try all sorts of experiments in Italy. And among those, he makes Rome basically his capital. He holds court there. He launches the construction of a brand new palace on the Palatine Hill. He toys with the idea of restoring the Roman Senate. He appoints a prefect, a patrician, a panel of judges that are versed in Roman law. And all these are checks on papal power. He's basically trying to snuff out papal power in the crib. This is before the Gregorian reforms. This is before all those popes named Gregory that come and totally change the game and make it so that the popes have a good deal of temporal power in addition to spiritual power. He's quite successful in his dealings with the Poles, the Hungarians, the Bohemians. As I say, he presides over the turn of the millennium, so he goes on this millennial circuit across his entire realm. He ends up in Aachen, the city of Charlemagne. Boleslav the Brave, who's this double duke of Bohemia and Poland, he's there with him. They swap out Charlemagne's clothing. They cut his nails, which have kept growing. So they take this to be a miracle. And they swap his nose with a golden one. They take a tooth from his mouth, which becomes a relic. And this is a very important step toward canonizing Charlemagne, which is a disputed canonization, but it culminates in this disputed canonization under Frederick Barbarossa. And Frederick II, who we'll talk about later, also goes and does something very similar in Aachen later. Otto III's tragedy is that he might have been S tier if he had he had some sort of disaster to solve, but at the very least A tier if he had lived as long a life as Charlemagne. But he was, as I said, struck down in his prime, and ultimately his life becomes an example of what not to do. So do not go to Italy and get malaria and die. This is something the Salians keep in mind. And then 19th century German historians also, they take the lesson of his life to be focused on Germany. Don't get embroiled in Italy. He should have been spending more time north of the Alps. So ultimately, I mean, he's extraordinarily interesting, but I guess I would put him in C tier.
All right, medieval scholar, what do you think?
I would probably have to agree, mainly because I don't know too much about him, so I'll have to take David's expertise for it. But no, I do know that he did not, like he said, he did not have a big tragedy to solve like many of the rulers here, or at the least there was no big apocalyptic event for him to deal with. So yeah, I think C is a fair spot. He was average. He had moments where he was great, but in terms of many of the people on this list, I would say, yeah, he's average.
Being average at being great is still great.
Indeed.
So I think that's fair.
100%.
All right, Louis IX.
Whew. It's going to be hard to talk about Louis IX in 60 to 90 seconds. So Louis IX was King of France from November 8th, 1226, when he was crowned in Reims at the age of 12, and then he ruled until his death in 1270, when he died in North Africa. Louis was responsible for large and significant legal reform in France. He created the royal justice mechanism that allowed essentially petitioners to appeal directly to the monarch. Louis was also the only French king to be declared a saint. He was canonized by Pope Boniface VIII in 1297. When he was king of France, he was exceptionally humble and pious, and he served meals to over 100 poor people on ordinary days, often serving these people himself on his personal property. Louis is the model, I would believe, the model ruler in terms of the Catholic Church. And while on crusade, Louis was the man who came into possession of the crown of thorns, a piece of the true cross, as well as a nail, which now he originally housed them in. I'm forgetting the name of I'm drawing a blank on the name of the chapel in France that he personally had. But now it's housed in Notre Dame. I would say Louis deserves a spot in S tier for multiple reasons, but especially the legal reform in France, as well as being likely the greatest Catholic ruler that the church has ever seen.
Was he drawing on Roman law in his reforms of the French legal system?
I believe he was, yes.
Yeah, and he abolishes trials by ordeal. Is that right?
Yes. He abolished trials by ordeals, and he sought to terminate private wars. And he brought in the presumption of innocence into criminal proceedings, so innocent until proven guilty. And he was also known, he had a nickname, a moniker, as the Monk King. He was staunchly Christian,
Right.
rigorously enforced Catholic ideals, and he brought upon harsh laws and punishments on blasphemy.
Right, and he was tough on Jews.
Mm-hmm.
He was tough on blasphemy. The popes loved him.
Yeah,
The popes
they adored him.
They adored him. Yeah, and he's the only French saint king.
Yes, and he was captured and ransomed during the Seventh Crusade, and then he, unfortunately, during the Eighth Crusade, contracted dysentery and died. So a tragic end to a incredible ruler.
Life in France was pretty stable at that time, right? Like for average French
For average, yeah.
people. No.
Not in Languedoc, right?
Yeah, no. If we ignore the Albigensian Crusade, then yeah, France is pretty stable. If we incorporate the Albigensian Crusade, then it's pretty standard for the Middle Ages.
Mhm.
All right, so what do you think? S tier then, before or after Otto?
I say he goes above Otto. Sorry, David.
I gotta disagree. I don't know. I don't know that I know enough about him. Certainly not as much as you, medieval scholar. I don't know. To me, there's a few rulers in the Middle Ages that are paradigm shifters.
Mm-hmm.
We'll cover some more of them. I think Otto the Great is one of those. He is a foundational figure for Germany. Charlemagne is not as much of a founder figure for Germany as you might think. Nowadays, he's much more associated with France, despite his city being Aachen. And part of that's the Merovingian heritage, and the fact that, Frank, modern day France is kind of the power base of the Carolingian line. So Otto is that kind of George Washington figure, and we'll look at some more George Washington figures. But Otto is that for Germany, whereas I don't know that Louis IX was certainly important. I don't know that he's as much of a setter of paradigms. He's as foundational figure, let's say.
I definitely agree with what you said. My argument for Louis is just of how important he was to Christianity as a whole. Not only just being the only French monarch to be canonized as a saint, especially being canonized so quickly after his death. It was only about 27 years. But also the recovery of the most pivotal relics in Christendom during his life, bringing them back to Christian Europe, and now them being housed in Notre Dame, where you can see them, especially most notably the crown of thorns.
I will say Otto the Great got the Holy Lance, so he busts that out in Lechfeld. I think that's got to be a point in his favor too.
And Otto the Great didn't die of dysentery in North Africa. So
Yeah.
yeah, so eh, I would say it's once again, Mike. I think it's up to you to be the tiebreaker.
You guys are
There's
both making
there's
great points. I need like a coin to flip.
Unlike Philip, there's no hard feelings on your decision here.
Yeah. I think David's point about being pivotal is maybe just a slight edge in Otto's favor, or being a paradigm shifter, if you will, because Louis the Ninth is obviously exceptional in a lot of ways. Although this is obviously one of the reasons actually why I didn't include Richard in the list, is because in a way I think you can make an argument that crusading. I'm a huge Crusade fan, but you can make an argument that there is a bit of a negative aspect of that to their own countries.
Most certainly.
And I think actually the argument, the point that you could make for that is actually Philip Augustus, and that like he was in a lot of ways able to set himself up for success against Richard when he came home, and then obviously against John, because he abandoned the Crusades and was then able to basically save his treasure, go home, start scheming, do all these things.
He was incredibly cunning.
Yeah, but I think that there's an aspect to crusading, and again, I'm a big fan, but I think that there's an aspect to that is a bit of a draw on the native population, if you will. And so I think sort of those kind of two angles a little bit, the paradigm shifting and, a slight negative point for crusading. I think I'm going to leave Louis below.
Maybe I
Otto.
should clarify too. I think maybe I'm thinking about S a little bit differently, in that I'm thinking of S as like a once in multiple generations figure. I think you can make the case that any of the people on this list are once in a generation. Like they stood out in their respective generation of, let's say, if you define a generation as like a 20-year time span. But if you take multiple generations, like Charlemagne is an easy example of this, right? Like once in maybe a millennium, type of figure, right? Like hey,
grandfather of Europe.
Yeah, you got to wait for Napoleon now for somebody like Charlemagne, who unites that giant chunk of territory. Otto the Great. So I would almost put Charlemagne in a league of his own, like you were saying, medieval scholar, like S plus. But Otto the Great certainly, like whatever you say, he's the first. And some of the other people in our list, like whatever you say about them, they're the first. I think that there's something to that makes them once in multiple generations, maybe. But an A among a list like this, I mean, is still great. Otto III was extraordinary. Again, how many rulers get a title like Wonder of the World, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to die at 21. But, I put him at C because ultimately, luck, fate, chance, it's always an element in these assessments. And you need to have both. You need to have the ability, but you also need chance on your side.
Agreed.
That's a good point. Maybe the S tier. I don't know. I think we should keep. I'm going to keep Louis in the S tier, but I think he's going to go to the bottom of the S tier because I do think that as far as his, he didn't do that paradigm shift like you're saying. He maybe wasn't. He maybe didn't impact the multiple generations in the same way, but I think that he was I agree with a lot of medieval scholars' points about his exemplary attributes in the various ways where he was like the ideal monarch in many ways.
Yeah, I'll also give medieval scholar this. Germany has no comparable saint king, really. Even Charlemagne's sainthood is disputed, like we talked about. So, Germany really has no saint king. That's a pretty remarkable thing. And he's the only French saint king, like we discussed. So I get his impact in terms of broader Christendom.
Mhm. Otherwise, put Louis in A tier if it was not for his impacts for on overall Christianity. But his
Yeah,
discovery of Christ's relics on crusade, despite the negative connotations that crusading may have, I think is what puts him just over the top to get him into S tier.
makes sense.
All right, he'll be at the bottom of S tier. So next we have Alfred the Great. Alfred, he had to fight for his kingdom. He was, boy, I did so much studying. It's a little melting together. I believe he was King of Wessex, and then there was Mercia, and he ended up having to fight the various Viking hordes who were coming in, the various Viking raiders, and things were going pretty poorly for him. And actually, his older brother, I believe, was killed in a battle, who was the king before him. And anyway, he had to fight for his ability to become king. He ended up unifying the lower end of England and became the king of the Angles and the Saxons. And not only did he fight and then win his kingdom, but then he also, kind of similar to Charlemagne, sort of began his own intellectual renaissance, attracting scholars and even translating books on his own. I didn't even realize this, but there's actually several translations of books that are ascribed to Alfred that he personally transcribed on his own. And he reformed the law quite a bit. He ended up, he made a treaty with the Danes when he first initially won his kingdom, and then used the time in between to get the rest of the nobility on the same page and build essentially garrisons, these burgs, these fortresses across England to repel the Viking invaders when they came back, and which actually made it easy for him then, or I should say easy, but easier for him to retain control and fight off the invaders. So he won his crown, ruled in a way that you would hope, and started off a scholarly renaissance, as well as then defending his kingdom. I'm going to give him B tier to start with. So
Whoa.
I'm gonna give him B. We're gonna calm down on like you guys can correct me. You can correct me. Part of, like you said, I think the generational impact. Maybe that's too low. Maybe I'm getting carried away. You can maybe I'm correcting too hard in the other direction. So go ahead.
I might be overcorrecting because I think you're. I think that's the traditional historiography on him, is that. Well, I wasn't planning on talking about this until later, but I think like English school children, their history begins with William the Conqueror, and Alfred the Great gets kind of swept under the rug. And then, so recently I think the historiography is that there's been this trend toward saying actually Alfred was super important and he was a very interesting personality and all that. So from everything I know, I would have put him in A at least. He does get that. You don't, every time somebody gets the title Magnus or the Great,
that's a good point.
You do have to listen.
Although he wasn't called the Great in his lifetime. I believe it was like 13th century that he.
And many aren't. And many aren't, right? Many aren't. Sometimes they're, sometimes the contemporary chronicles are pretty.
Except for Richard the Lionheart in the eyewitness account of the Third Crusade is referred to by his biographer as the Great. Awesome. Anyway,
we're gonna start Jaffa posting here in the video.
Anyway, what do you think, medieval scholar, about Alfred? B tier.
I think he deserves higher for an assortment of reasons. So even before he even became king, so he fought. He was also a warrior. So he fought alongside his brother. I think it was.
And I think it
was King Aethelred.
Yeah, Aethelred.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had. I believe he had Crohn's disease, is what historians think he had.
Wow.
So he fought along with his brother King Aethelred at the Battle of Ashdown. He led much of his soldiers. I'm actually referencing back to my thread here I did on Alfred last year. He led his men to the battlefield. Yeah, # shameless plug.
Awesome.
So he would lead his men on the battlefield. The Saxons would fight up the ridge against the Vikings. But despite it being a heavy and costly battle, Alfred and the Saxon men would end up victorious. Now, aside from just being a warrior, Alfred also provided a lot of reform and establishment into what would eventually become England. He created his reforms created the establishment of a standing army and navy, which for the purpose of defending the lands against impending Viking raids. He also created he also created his own legal code called the Dooms, which was the groundwork for English common law that we know it as now, which emphasized justice and fairness, no matter what your social status was, whether you were king or you were just some peasant, you had as equal rights as you could have. He was incredibly legally fair, and much of the reforms that you see, even from his time, you can still see its impact in modern legal reforms now in England and across the world.
Maybe that's too. That's a good breakdown. I think he's kind of like a Charlemagne figure exclusively for England in a way, because so he comes from this western, well, like southern chunk of it, right, Wessex, and he goes on to unify. He Christianizes this. He Christianizes Guthrum, right?
Yep.
Yes.
And then ultimately, though, there's a different sort of founder figure afterward, who's William the Conqueror. But he is this sort of, he's coming at a time when the borders aren't clear, and history could have been very, very different if Alfred the Great hadn't lived. You could conceive of maybe multiple kingdoms.
Or even if he hadn't won
England.
the battle that he won, Edgington, or I forget what exactly the name of that one is, but if he hadn't won that battle, who knows?
Yeah, Edgington.
He also supported, I think you mentioned it, but he promoted like religious education. He wanted to see England unified under God, under Christianity. I forget if he actually succeeded that in his lifetime, but I think his pursuit of that in general is also something to be commended.
All right, so then do we want to put him above Philip Augustus or behind Philip Augustus?
I'm saying above.
I'm gonna say above. It makes me sick to say it, but yeah, I think we put him above Philip.
All right. Next up, Frederick II.
Okay, so very well. First off, he rules Sicily. He inherits it at like age 3, in 1198, and he rules it from 1198 onwards, more or less. There's a lot of weird title swapping during his reign, just to keep the popes happy. And the popes, actually, one pope helps raise him, which is ironic given how much trouble he gets in with the papacy later. He's Holy Roman Emperor from 1220 to 1250. That is a good chunk of time. Gives him a lot of time to get his agenda across. He's a very Otto III-like figure, except he's Otto III if he would have survived, basically. Nietzsche calls him the first European. So Nietzsche was all over him, but he's quite underrated today. He is the grandson of Frederick Barbarossa. Another parallel, right? Because I would very much compare Barbarossa and Otto the Great to their respective grandsons. Otto III, Frederick II, right? These are the more, compared to like more straightforward, zealous type of figures, you get more intellectual, more unorthodox figures. Ultimately, Frederick II is excommunicated 4 times, and his reign coincides with a time when the papacy is ascendant. It's very expansionary, very aggressive. He's up against a Gregory IX, who takes that name because of Gregory VII, the great reformer pope who forces Henry IV to kneel at Canossa. And, so there's this backdrop of who is going to rule Christendom, the pope or the emperor. Now, despite all that, he actually launches arguably the most successful crusade since the First Crusade, that being the so-called Sixth Crusade. He wins a diplomatic victory in Jerusalem because he knows a little bit of Arabic, and he's a fantastic diplomat. And so he managed to negotiate for Jerusalem. And then, where he really wants to be is Sicily. So this is his playground. This is an experiment in state building. He establishes the University of Naples, the oldest state-funded learning institution in the world, today one of the largest universities in Europe. His court is home to the Sicilian School of Poets. They invent the 14-line sonnet. Very, very important for Dante, Petrarch, all the rest of it. Very proto-Renaissance. In architecture, one chronicler gushes that palaces were built with incomparable fervor and of such beauty and proportions as though Frederick was going to be able to live forever. Many of those were torn down by the Angevin dynasty that actually comes and unseats his son, Manfred. But one of them is Castel del Monte, which still stands in Apulia, and it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site today. And lastly, he even manages to squeeze in a landmark treatise on ornithography, on birds. He is a big falconer, and there's even a David Attenborough segment on natural curiosities where he gives a big lesson on Frederick II, because he was not just a patron, he was also, like I say, a brain himself. Like he studied birds and was able to make some very interesting observations about swallows, vultures, and a whole bunch of other species. So that's his character and legacy. Ultimately, he does overstretch himself, like Otto III. He's good for Sicily. He does things in Sicily that no one's ever seen. He's bad for Germany, but maybe bad in hindsight. Like, people actually liked him in Germany because he left them alone. It was kind of benign neglect in Germany. He really wanted to be in Sicily. His victory in Jerusalem lasts a couple decades. It gets reversed. So, no real solid gains there, but it is successful in achieving its aim, and it does get his excommunication lifted. So ultimately, I think a lot of it comes down to what he accomplished in Sicily, but he's not S tier. He doesn't have a Lechfeld. He doesn't pacify the Saxons, nothing like that. Ultimately, I guess I would put him, it's tough to say, either A or B tier, and I'm leaning toward B.
I would have to agree with that. I would say B tier is very fair for Frederick. I would say if it wasn't for his negotiation of reclaiming Jerusalem without a single drop of blood being spilled to take the city is remarkable considering its time. I would say without, and also doing it, I believe he was doing it while he was excommunicated. So
Not
he
only
kind of,
that, he has a Muslim bodyguard unit
yeah,
because you had all these Muslims in Sicily who get like transported every which way. They get resettled under his reign, but then they're kind of like, they're his guys, right? There's like nobody else looking out for him, so he kind of makes himself their patron and their protector, and so he has this. So he literally embarks from Sicily, from the port of Brindisi, excommunicated, with a unit of Muslim bodyguards to go reclaim Jerusalem. So there's a contradiction in terms, right? An excommunicated crusader.
he was like, okay, he's like, all these crusades, they're not going well. I'm gonna take Jerusalem back. I'm
Yeah,
excommunicated. I'm gonna do it myself anyways.
yeah.
And he reclaims Jerusalem. Not a blood is spilled. And he goes into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre after the city is formally surrendered, and he places the crown on top of his head as like a statement of like, this is our accomplishment. This is me. This
Very
is who I am.
Napoleonic.
This, yeah, very Napoleonic. This is what we've done. This is what I've done. And for what he did, he gets unexcommunicated by the Pope in August of 1230.
Oh,
So
there's one more aspect of the irony, which is, so he's out crusading and the Pope is invading Sicily. so, and like part of the story, I think, is his father-in-law, who I guess he is unfaithful to his daughter, who's Frederick's wife. And so the Pope's like, yeah, we'll back you in your invasion of Sicily. So this is just a crazy time, right?
Yeah, this is like Frederick like did this for Christendom, but he also I'd like to imagine that he also did it as like flipping a big bird to all the people that were trying to ruin him essentially for much of his rule.
Yeah.
Uh, and
It,
they
yeah.
have no choice but to admit that and basically thank Frederick for the things that he's done and excommunicate or unexcommunicate him and all these things.
Yeah, like it was the last good move on the table for him. He was excommunicated because I mean he goes to Aachen when he wins the crown of Germany after the Battle of Bouillon. The Battle of Bouillon basically sets him up to become Holy Roman Emperor. He because his rival then retreats to Saxony, I believe, and is bludgeoned to death by clergymen, apparently. So then he becomes emperor, and he goes to Aachen, the city of Charlemagne, and he gives it the Otto III treatment. He actually puts him in a new tomb, and he pledges. I think just in a moment of kind of youth, keep in mind he's very young at this point. Kind of a moment of youthful exuberance, he pledges to go on crusade, and his tutor, the current pope at that time, was kind of shocked by this. He gave no heads up, and then he just delays, and ultimately it would be almost a decade before he finally goes. So he's excommunicated because he postponed so long. And then when he goes and embarks on crusade, he's excommunicated a second time. So that's 2 out of
Yeah,
4 of the excommunications, and then there would be 2 more because of all the trouble he had in Italy. Italy was this very hard to pacify place. You had the disease, but you also had these cities that their original street plans go back to the times of the Romans. They're very proud of their heritage, just on a municipal basis. They're very rich. They're very populated. And Barbarossa, Frederick's grandfather, also has a lot of trouble pacifying them. And the Pope gets wrapped up in it, and he excommunicates him 2 more times. So ultimately, just the images his life conjures up, it's enough to be S tier. He's S tier in spirit, but in terms of
yeah.
material legacy,
It's the thought that
unfortunately,
counts. If it was all about heart and spirit, then Frederick would be S tier.
yeah,
But
like he deserves a
upon
movie.
execution, yeah, absolutely. The
He
the
deserves a movie, and like Hollywood would probably go for somebody like Frederick. Like like
he's
you
a
could
great
tell
biopic
he's
character.
a great biopic, but yeah, in terms of material legacy, it's very
Yeah.
limited to
In
Sicily, I think.
theory, he's an S tier. In execution, he's a B tier.
Yeah.
He certainly did incredible things. There's a lot of things that he could have done better. There's a lot
Yes.
of things that he failed at. But
Yeah.
what matters is that uh, his foundational incredible things that he accomplished in his life were groundbreakingly incredible, and I would say he's very comfortably in B tier.
Yeah.
S tier in spirit. I like that. I was reading a little bit about Frederick before we started. Tell us a little bit about the human experiments.
So yeah, there's some crazy human experiments that he's accused of because he's experimenting on birds, right? Like with vultures and stuff. And so there's this dark legend that sprouts about him putting basically locking children away and forbidding anybody from having any human contact with them. So none of the things that kind of babies need, no nurturing from the mother, nothing, just purely fed and then back to the dark. Because he wanted to find out what was the original language of Eden. So what language Adam and Eve spoke. This is one of the experiments he does, apparently among others. Another is that he invites 2 men to go sup with him, and then he sends one to sleep and one to hunt, and then he has them both cut open to see who digested his food better. Um, so this is all
Those
probably
were
fake.
prisoners, I think. To be fair to him, I think those were prisoners.
Yes, I mean probably. I think it's just fake. Um,
Yeah, a lot of people didn't like him at the time. I think it's fair to
yeah.
assume that it might have been just bad gossip trying to sully his name even more than they were already doing.
Yes. Another one was that he put a prisoner in a barrel and had him starve to death. And there was a opening in the barrel because he wanted to see if the soul would escape, right? If the soul would escape from the hole in the barrel.
It's like comically maniacal. these
Yeah.
things that they're saying about him. He's like
Yes.
a cartoon villain.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a certain practicality about it, like he wanted to see the soul, so he locked the dude in the barrel with only the little, whatever the tap hole for the thing, so he could see the person's soul escape. There's a certain
It's
like
like very Looney
simplistic,
Tunes.
It
yeah,
is. It's cartoonish quality, and then also not only that, he has like actually like on pretty semi good ground here, like a harem. Like he has, he keeps a harem, so he makes his wives and the popes very unhappy with his antics. He's disconcertingly too close to the Muslim population, despite not really being all that great for them. Like uprooting these communities, um, kind of an Andrew Jackson type of figure in Sicily, but he's actually accused of being way too close to them, keeping a harem, staying in these lavish Muslim palaces. So there's this very sort of orientalizing legend around him, which has been romanticized in the 19th century in a different time, but then back then was obviously, points against him. The popes just despised him.
yeah, really interesting figure. All right, Henry V.
This is my Richard the Lionheart, Mike.
Yeah,
I don't mess around with Henry V. He's England's greatest warrior king, whether you want to hear that or not. Henry V, born Henry of Monmouth. He's a son of Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, Henry the Usurper, whatever you want to call him. Henry was Prince of Wales. He was King of England from 1413 until he died in 1422. He's remarkably known by everyone who studies him for his outstanding successes during the Hundred Years' War against France. He has his own play with William Shakespeare. Henry is known for not being some massive, like when you imagine warrior kings, you think of some sort of massive buff leader, but no, Henry was he was athletic, but he was slim. He was clean shaven, and he had a like a standard military haircut. He had a big scar on his face from the arrow that he took during the Battle of Shrewsbury. Was it Shrewsbury? Yeah, I believe so.
yeah, with Shrewsbury.
Against Henry Percy, Harry Hotspur, whatever you want to call him. He takes an arrow in his face, goes all the way and 6 inches, I believe, deep into his skull. And it's something that during the time is just not something you should survive. But he miraculously survives thanks to the royal doctor. He inherits the throne from his father upon his death. I remember in the movie The King that it depicts Henry as someone who wanted to avoid war with France. This is not the case. Henry actually desperately wanted war with France very badly. Henry loved to fight. He wanted to go to war with France, and so in 1415 he follows the wake of Edward III, who is his great grandfather, and he renews war with France, and he sets sail across the Channel to France. His military campaign is well documented. He lays siege to Harfleur, captures it, the port city, establishes a base there, a garrison, and obviously no introduction. Not much to say about it that isn't already known. His incredible against all odds victory at Agincourt against a French number that by the numbers should have absolutely annihilated Henry's forces. The Marshal of France, much of the nobility of France was wiped out during the Battle of Agincourt. Henry, to some scrutiny today, executes all the French prisoners for an assortment of reasons. One, they have fear that the remaining French force may regroup and attack them from behind, and they don't want to worry about soldiers having to stay and guard the prisoners so they don't rise up and fight against them. They also don't have the food and resources to keep them well fed and hydrated and things like that. So he has them executed. Even French scholars at the time, even French contemporaries, say that they don't blame Henry for what he did. And it was, even though you can look at it as an immoral or potentially, quote, evil thing to do, it is the correct thing to do. When you study history and you study rulers, there are many instances where doing the right thing isn't necessarily the good thing. So he conquers much of Normandy, much of northern France, and he diplomatically comes to an agreement with Charles VI, King of France, also known as Charles the Mad, which results in the largest holding of French territory by an English king since the Angevins. The Treaty of Troy in 1420, it recognizes Henry V as regent of France and heir apparent to the throne, so he will take the throne after Charles VI dies. Obviously, this is unfortunately not what happened, because Henry died in 1422 of dysentery while still on campaign. So it's a big what if on history. But if Henry did succeed Charles VI, who would have known what, this United Kingdom would have looked like? It should be also known that Henry fought in the vanguard in Agincourt. He fought on the front lines with his soldiers. He wasn't some ruler to look on and watch his men fight with him. He looked at his soldiers as people that were no lesser than him, no better than him. They were all equals. So he fought with his men on the front lines, bearing his colors and everything. He could have easily have been a prime target for the French, and yet he fought on and claimed a victory in the jaws of death and defeat anyways. I'm going to have to say that Henry is a S, and this is also including my heavy bias towards him. At the very least,
go ahead,
he's an A.
Yeah, well, okay, look, he's S in spirit. He gets a Shakespeare. He gets a Hollywood movie, probably more so because of the Shakespeare. Actually, Dan Jones, I think, just published a book called "The Great England's Greatest King."
Yes,
I'm. Right?
If my camera was on, if I was not a proud Anon, I would be holding it.
You have to join us.
I'm holding it up at my camera right now. I have one of the 1,000 numbered first edition signed copies.
Cool.
I was very, once I saw this book was announced, I knew that I had to have it.
Yeah.
England's Greatest Warrior King is on the
Indeed.
title.
It's a great book. Even if you're not someone who's incredibly biased towards Henry V like me, this is a book that I think that everyone should read.
Is Dan Jones following you on X now?
No, he isn't, and I really wish
if you're watching this, Dan Jones, do the right
Dan
thing.
Jones,
go spam Dan Jones, will you?
Dan Jones, if you watch this,
do the right thing.
Do the right thing. I'm a big fan of you. If you don't, I understand. No hard feelings.
All right, what do you think, David?
It's the greatest warrior king. You nailed it. That's the caveat, right? But I just wonder, like, how different history would have been if he wasn't around. What was the lasting impact? That's the only thing. I guess that's the only question mark in my mind.
It could be argued, like, how much of a difference did he really make, if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty details about it, because France still ends up winning the 100 Years' War after their victory at Castillon.
Yeah. He dies pretty early, right? 35?
Yes, he dies incredibly young. Same age as his brother Thomas. And I also believe same age as his sister Philippa. I don't know what's going on with that family and everyone dying at 35. But
right when they could have run for POTUS.
Exactly, yeah.
It's a shame.
I wrote in Henry V on my ballot. Yeah, I think if Henry didn't die of dysentery and he did succeed Charles VI, then I believe that the Hundred Years' War just ends automatically there, at least to some degree.
It's one of the
Unfortunately,
great
yeah,
one of the
it's
great what ifs, right?
one of history's greatest what ifs. Um, Unfortunately, that's not how it played out. He died before Charles died, and France goes on to win the Hundred Years' War anyways. So, but for his time, Henry is a step above everybody
Yeah,
in terms of impact on not just England, but on the areas surrounding it as well, with his conquering of northern France. And obviously, the disastrous defeat that the French suffer at Agincourt. Countless noble houses are borderline ruined um, by all the members that they lose at the battle. Uh, yeah, so I would say at the very least he's an A.
So I'm going to
yeah,
push back
I would
on
agree.
this. I'm going to push back on this a little bit because, which, to be fair, I feel like I'm holding myself to the same standards because for a lot of these reasons, or a lot of the reasons why I didn't include Richard the Lionheart in my picks, is that, like you said, it ends up being a great what if, but we're not really
What
ranking
ifs?
what ifs.
Yeah,
That's one of the
Yeah.
reasons why Otto the Third is a C tier, is because he died young, and that's one of the reasons why I think Baldwin the Fourth is going to be rated pretty low, is because he also died pretty young. And so I think that not just dying young, if Henry had actually unified the crowns and ended the Hundred Years' War, I think you can make sort of a paradigm shifting
exactly.
argument with him. You can make sort of that argument that he did sort of that um, epic feat of statecraft, if you will, that
Mm-hmm.
really defines future generations. And I feel like like you said, what is the lasting impact in England, and ultimately, because for whatever reason, I have some sympathy, I think, for Henry VI. Obviously he's a bad king, but he grows up without a father and as a young man in a chaotic time. So with a lot of responsibility, I think that's
Mm-hmm.
it's a pretty tough thing, which, I'm not saying that Henry VI is Henry V's fault, but dying at 35 without any real, when you're king so young, secession should start to become, especially as a warrior king, which this is another fault of Richard's, to be fair, is that he didn't really prioritize the succession of what would happen, what could happen if something happened to him on the battlefield. So for me, which I'll let David be the decider on this one. I would put
Really?
him on
Wow.
B. I would put him on B tier. So we got S tier
Oh,
and B
Oh,
tier. So if you want to put him in A tier, we'll go with that, and you can
I
decide
think
where he goes.
bottom
Then,
of A
David.
maybe. Well, who
Yeah.
do we have in A right now? We have Alfred the Great and then
Philip
Philip
Augustus.
Augustus.
Philip Augustus. So Philip Augustus versus Hal.
I'll put Henry above Philip.
I think I
I think
agree. Yeah,
I
he
would
has a
say that's
Shakespeare.
fair.
He's a
Yeah,
Shakespeare.
he's a Shakespeare.
He's a Shakespeare.
He got his own Shakespeare.
Yeah,
Like
got his own. Does Philip Augustus have his
now
own
he's a
Shakespeare? And
yeah, and a Timothy
did
Chalamet
I
now.
was gonna say, did Timothy Chalamet play Philip Augustus? I don't think so.
Yeah, he didn't. No.
Yeah,
Not yet, at least.
not yet. Not yet.
All right, middle of B tier then. So the next one
A
we
tier.
will go to Alexios I, and this is I'm like I said, I'm very I'm pro Crusade. So this is a tough one for me, but I think Alexios is deserving because certainly for his time, for his people, as I guess we'll call him the emperor. I think that he was really, for his own people in his own time, he was magnificent. He had to come out of a time of extreme instability for the Byzantine Empire. He had to basically navigate a lot of internal politics, which then, once he became emperor, the empire was raided from the west by the Normans and was also losing territory in the east to the Seljuks. And really, to Alexios's credit, he was the man who set off the Crusades. So that's, in my opinion, a point in his book, if you will. although I don't think he'd see it that way. But he was able to not only come out of these chaotic times and lead his armies, although he did suffer quite a few defeats to the Normans, but he had some successful battles in the future. He was a competent general, I would say, but he also, the big thing for him, in my opinion, is that he stabilized Byzantine politics. He was able to basically consolidate a lot of the rule of the nobles. He created essentially a future system. He created the system that lasted into the future, where if I'm understanding correctly, all of the future emperors of the Byzantine Empire from then on out until the fall of Constantinople were related to him either by blood or through marriage. And that started with his consolidation of the ruling classes around his family, essentially, which worked out great for him. But maybe you could maybe make the argument that that sort of degraded over time as family members were preferred over those who maybe were a little bit more merit deserving. In any case, he came out of this time of extreme instability, put the empire back on a path to stability, started the Crusades. You can make the argument, I suppose, also that he, my opinion is that he should not have maybe treated the Crusaders as standard foreigners, meaning the way that they related as, through their foreign policy of requiring sort of this order. He didn't necessarily treat the Crusaders, in my opinion, as maybe a favored ally, or as they proved to be. I understand the suspicion with Bohemond and that sort of thing. Anyway, I feel like his impact was just very lasting, and very good for the Byzantine Empire and very good for his people. And he was, I would say, certainly a generational talent, and put the Byzantine Empire on a generational track to improvement. So I'd put him at the bottom of A tier, but I will let you guys chime in.
I
I
agree, like
think,
at least A
yeah,
tier. But go ahead.
um, I think it's also true that Emperor Alexios, even though he asked for their help, I'm pretty sure after they came through Constantinople and they passed into Asia Minor, that he actually didn't even expect to see them ever again. Uh, if I'm right on that, I'm pretty sure Emperor Alexios he was hopeful, but I think he also believed that he was likely not going to see the Crusader force ever again. He probably expected them to uh, be crushed by the Seljuks, like what happened at Manzikert, which obviously is not what happens. Um, I've studied the First Crusade in abundance and amount, but I haven't studied Emperor Alexios too much. So I'll have to take your knowledge and word for it, and I'll pass it over to David and see what he has to say.
I basically agree with that. Not too much more to add. I think it was hugely consequential. Maybe even S tier, but I'll defer to you on that. Very consequential. And he gets the Alexiad. Obviously, it's written by his daughter, but it's a great epic. Great epic in the style of the ancient mode. So that's kind of nice to see too.
That is true. He is very consequential. I mean, we can move him up a little bit if you guys want to move him up. I think I'll leave it up to you guys.
This
Yeah,
is the one where I will fiercely defend Philip.
you
I'm
will,
gonna
won't you?
have I think Emperor Alexios deserves to be an A tier, but I don't believe. Now, this may also just be coming from the fact that I don't know too much about Eastern Roman history, but I'm gonna have to say, with the knowledge that I have right now, that he is below Philip II.
Is he third? Was he third or fourth?
Philip II is third
No,
right now,
I just
below
mean
Henry.
Alexios. Does he deserve to be third or fourth
Uh,
in A tier? What do you guys think?
Here, medieval scholar, just look at the rankings, okay?
yeah, I'm looking.
How does
You're a
that make you
horrible
feel?
person. It
How,
makes
how
me
does that
feel
make you
Good,
very
feel?
bad?
painful. I've had to watch three people overtake Philip.
Mm, not. I don't have a strong opinion on this. It's on you, Mike.
I think the problem for me, I feel like is Henry higher than Philip?
In my heart, he is. In reality, I'm not sure.
Because Alexios is more consequential for generations afterwards than Henry, right?
And more regions, right? Like Hal's kind of limited. Well, England and France, right?
Because I can see the argument for Philip, but I don't know if for Henry V if I feel like he's
Well,
got
Alexios
quite the
kind of
lasting impact.
he took the genie, the Crusader genie, out of the bottle, right? Like that is huge. That is huge. So he should probably be, yeah, third, second, third.
I'm
All
just
right,
going to close my eyes and let it happen.
all right, we'll go. We'll go there. We'll keep him behind Philip, but I think ahead of Henry is fair.
Okay.
All right, William the Conqueror.
Okay. 1066, enough said, right? He is the Duke of Normandy. He's descended from the Viking settler Rollo, who you may know from Vikings TV show, Vikings, with great liberties being taken. He's apparently the brother of Ragnar Lothbrok. No such associations historically. And William gets in the running for the Kingdom of England because he's related to the childless Edward the Confessor. He goes up against Harold Godwinson, who had just tragically defeated Harold Hardrada, who was one of the great badasses of history, but he defeats him at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. There's a Viking warrior in a post-Christian age defending that bridge, but he gets mowed down. And ultimately, Harold Godwinson loses to William at the Battle of Hastings, which, it's one of those great battles. Like Lechfeld, and it's immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry. And William founds a new dynasty, the Dynasty of Normandy. He introduces new Norman elite in England. He brings the French language, certain trappings of feudalism too, and he goes on a castle building spree. And I already mentioned this part, that basically if you are growing up in England, your history starts with William. So he is a George Washington type of figure, comparable to what Otto would be for Germany and what Charlemagne would be for France these days. So I think he's an S tier.
I agree. I think William the Conqueror is a non-debate S tier.
Wow,
England
non-debate
is not the England that we know it as today if
Yeah.
it is not for William the Conqueror and his choices to go for the throne, to cross into England, to invade, fight at the Battle of Hastings, win the Battle of Hastings. That battle, it can be argued as one of the biggest battles that shifts the, like you said, paradigm shifters, where it shifts the course of human history as we know it.
Yeah.
Had Harold Godwinson won at Hastings, or by some grace, Harold Hardrada somehow comes out on top over both of them, the world is entirely different than we know it as today. William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings literally gives birth to a nation. England is England because of him. World history happens because of that defining moment. So yeah, I think he's very easily S tier.
You guys have both said S tier, so I'm outvoted. But I'm just going to say my counterpoint here has 9 months to prepare to fight an exhausted army in a very mediocre victory.
Are you saying this
basically nothing else gets fat? I just think he's really
are you
overrated.
saying,
I think.
Are you saying
I
this
understand.
is a Mickey Mouse crown?
No, I understand the consequentiality of it. It's obviously a very consequential thing. If Hastings breaks the other way, obviously history is completely different.
He's
I
lucky.
understand.
I think
I
that he's
just feel
lucky,
like
right?
I just feel like it's very overblown, sort of
Mm,
like not the consequential, but like, now his nickname is the
the Conqueror, yeah.
Conqueror. It's like he's like this big influential. When you think about, he's not S tier in spirit. Okay, that's what I think. That's what bothers
I
me here.
Yeah, I might agree with you on that. I think, but it's just goes back to that question of
It's
like
just like the
some
butterfly
guys get
effect.
lucky. Yeah, it's the butterfly effect, and also you need to have chance on your side. He certainly did.
Sure.
Yeah,
He certainly did.
every ruler cannot be a good ruler without some shred of luck.
Yeah, yeah, of
Or
course.
certainly not great.
Yeah,
Certainly not great.
And
But
yeah.
you
like I
can
said, I'm not
you can be
arguing the
good.
consequentiality of it, but just let's compare to a figure like Alexios or Frederick II. I mean, these other types of guys seem just like giants of men.
It's another
Whereas
big what if. It's like
William
if he fights Harold Godwinson, if
sort of
like if Harold Godwinson was his army was rested, they weren't exhausted and spent from fighting at Stamford Bridge. What is the outcome of Hastings? We don't know, and we'll never know. Uh,
Yeah, like there's
it's
plenty
a
of
big what
Normans
if.
that seem more impressive than him, right? Like maybe some of the guys who went to Sicily, Robert
yeah,
Guiscard, right? Like these
yeah.
are really,
He
really like
he was
guys are
actually jealous
unbanded.
of those guys, by the way.
I'm sure, right? I'm sure.
Yeah, that's like apparently a big thing was like him sort of like being very jealous of Robert Guiscard.
He's like, I'll show him.
Which again, I guess I can't argue against the consequentiality. I'm not arguing against his impact or any of that sort of stuff. He just seems like, as a man, as a historical figure, he just seems very, dare I say, average relative, certainly to the field. Um,
It's a hot take.
he's not a
It's a hot
vigorous
take for
guy.
sure.
He's not doing a lot of stuff. He's, okay, he
Mm.
builds a few castles and he commissions the Doomsday Book. Like, okay, but that was like 30 years. What other
Yeah.
battles did he win? He's not like running around doing stuff. He's sort of just like being jealous of Robert Guiscard and getting fat. I don't know.
Damn.
But, yeah, I mean, hey,
Damn.
when you put it like that,
Damn.
you know, wins one battle, builds a lot of castles, is jealous for his whole life, refuses to elaborate, gets fat, dies. It's like,
Right. Yeah. Corpse explodes. All right. Godfrey of Bouillon.
okay, so Godfrey is going to be writing this list a lot from spirituality. So Godfrey is he's nicknamed the First Crusader, representative. A lot of people look at him as the ideal knight of the Middle Ages. Fought a bear with his bare hands. Uh, he is regarded by his contemporaries. He's brave. He's courageous. One of the leaders of the First Crusade. He takes part in the sieges of Nicaea, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Uh, him and his men are one of the reasons why the Crusader army breaches the city of Jerusalem and ends up taking it. He sells or mortgages a lot of his estates to the bishops to fund his own army of crusaders. Plays a crucial role against the Seljuks. At the Battle of Dorylaeum, he helped relieve a vanguard uh, of soldiers that were pinned down by the Seljuks, resulting in a turnaround Crusader victory. Like I said, his men at Jerusalem breaches the walled city, crosses into the city, inspires his fellow Crusaders, and leads them in. And upon taking and capturing Jerusalem, Godfrey, the kingdom of Jerusalem is established. Godfrey becomes its first ruler. He notoriously states that he refuses to wear a crown of gold where Jesus wore a crown of thorns. Revered for his piety and his bravery in battle. And he is buried today in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Unfortunately, Godfrey dies essentially immediately after. Godfrey dies in 1100 at the age of 40, so not even a full year after the end of the First Crusade. So I'm gonna have to say that Godfrey, you guys can debate on it. I'm probably gonna put him in C tier. A lot of it is off of spirit. In spirit, he's S tier in my heart. In reality, he's probably a C tier.
That may be so, but I thought this was the greatest kings in history. I gotta say D tier. What is this guy? He's an advocate. No, he refuses. He refuses. And this is obviously very symbolic, and I get the politics behind it, but also maybe genuine spirituality, like you said, crown of thorns, not crown of gold. But he refuses to be king, right? He's the ruler of the kingdom of Jerusalem as advocate of the Holy Sepulchre.
Yeah, he's the defender of the Holy Sepulchre,
Okay.
which I mean you can say is probably just the same thing. It's just different words.
Yeah.
So he rules the kingdom of Jerusalem. He only lives after the Battle of Ascalon. He only lives for like another 9 or something months, something like that, 10 months. He doesn't live a whole lot longer. He dies at age 40 in Jerusalem. So he does die as the leader, but you're not the leader for very long. Doesn't do much. I'll have to change my vote. He's probably D tier.
All right, D tier. That's fair.
But
Anyway,
he did fight a
I think
bear
that's
with his
fair.
fists.
Yeah, no, he's completely epic. But
Oh
just
yeah,
as
he's
a
an
king,
incredible
he
as a
only lived for
king.
1 year, so it's kind of tough, I think,
Yeah,
to give him any sort of
Yeah.
ranking in the list
as a
against
king below
everyone after
average,
that.
he'll probably make a return for when we do a tier list on warriors.
Oh
Yeah.
Which
warriors for
then will
sure.
be
Yeah,
that'll be Godfrey's revenge for.
for
Yeah.
sure.
But for leadership, as a ruler of a kingdom which has only just been born, he's certainly D tier.
For the medieval warrior one, we're gonna have a lot of guys bending horseshoes. Apparently, that is a very popular test of strength.
Oh,
Yeah,
Right? Have you guys heard of
interesting.
that?
No.
yeah, I have. There's also going to be a lot of it'll be mentioned again when we get to him, but in terms of great leaders and warriors, they seem to have a thing for fighting bears, and it's weird that it's happened twice.
No, Godfrey will definitely he'll be rated highly on the warrior one for sure.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Baldwin the First, Godfrey's younger brother, I believe. There's Eustace is his older brother, and Baldwin is his younger brother. So he also crusaded, but then upon Godfrey's death, the nobles of the kingdom of Jerusalem, basically there was essentially two factions. One wanted Bohemond to become king of Jerusalem, and the other faction wanted Godfrey's brother, and Godfrey obviously wanted his brother. So I believe it was the patriarch sent for Baldwin, who was Count of Edessa at that time, and Bohemond was unfortunately just before that captured in a battle with the Turks, I believe. So he was unable to really cause any problems or dispute any claims, and so Baldwin goes to Jerusalem and becomes king. Baldwin as king, I feel like he's somebody who's extremely suited for the time and place that he's in. Originally he was raised to join the church and become, a bishop or something like that. But then shortly when I believe actually from my reading of it, that there was some indication that he might have actually, because of the way that Godfrey inherited his lands from his childless uncle, that Baldwin was designated as Godfrey's heir then. And so there may have been some incentive there for him to basically drop out from joining the church and become a knight to then basically be able to take his inheritance claim. But in any case, he's traditionally trained as you would expect a cleric, but then drops out to become a knight, obviously has military victories on the First Crusade. He rivals a little bit with Tancred, which is Bohemond's nephew, but which that obviously plays in as Tancred essentially becomes Prince of Antioch, and then Baldwin is ruling in Jerusalem. So there's a little bit still of that rivalry going on, or lack of unity. But I feel like for Baldwin, he really is what the kingdom needs at that time. He's got sort of the understanding of the religious matters. but he also is a pretty fierce warrior in his own right and a capable commander. And he's able to also be very strategically diplomatic in the way that he negotiates these different alliances, is trying to get things set up and organize the various nobles or fight the various incursions from the Fatimids or the other Turks, and be able to really congeal the kingdom into something that is handed on. I think Baldwin, he did a lot of the work that would have been left for Godfrey had he lived. And in my opinion, Baldwin handled it pretty masterfully. I feel like the only real sort of the major slip up that he had was later in life, marrying Adelaide, who was the mother of Roger II, the King of Sicily, and having her shipped over and basically kind of taking her money and then shipping her back after a few years because the kingdom needed resources. However, in the short term, that probably worked out well because he got some resources. But in the long term, Roger II then was very hostile to the kingdom of Jerusalem, and that he should have been, I suppose, on paper, that should be sort of a natural or one of the foremost alliances that you would imagine that the kingdom of Jerusalem would want to make. So that's definitely a slip up in his against him, if you will. So I would put Baldwin at the bottom of B tier, but because I think that he was certainly just what the kingdom needed at the time, and performed what he and did, essentially establish the kingdom, was able to congeal the nobility, hold things together, fight what he needed to, and administer as he needed to, in a way that really he was able to pass on something better than he inherited, really. But I'll let you guys go ahead and take it from there.
Yeah, so he sets Jerusalem up on a firm footing. Um, I don't know too much about him, but your assessment um, sounds sound. I think I would agree with that ranking.
Yeah, your assessment is very comprehensive. He's essentially the first real ruler that the Kingdom of Jerusalem has after Godfrey dies exceptionally fast. Um, like David said, he lays a good groundwork and he puts the Kingdom of Jerusalem in a position for it to succeed. Um, yeah, I don't really have any qualms with the rating. I would say he's a B.
And what a pair of brothers. Good stock.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but did he fight a bear?
Well, looks like their positions may be reversed in a future episode. All right, Hugh Capet.
Okay, so he is not king of France, but king of the Franks, as everybody knows by now, because he ruled 987 to 996. Not tremendously long, but he was incredibly influential as a duke before that, in a place, West Francia, while it's turning into France, that has a very, very strong ascendant, entrenched nobility, ruling a very Romanized region, formerly Gaul. Hardened by Viking incursions, they bore the brunt of Viking attacks and also bearing the brunt of East Frankish incursions, right? And all these Carolingian attempts to, I will use your word, recongeal the Carolingian Empire. He's descended from Charlemagne, and he's also related to Otto the Great, but that does not stop him from chasing Otto II, the father of Otto III, away from France and destroying his baggage train. Um, Ultimately, he gets elected King of the Franks, in part because of that victory. And this follows on the heels of the last Carolingian monarch's untimely death. So he is a dynasty founder, much like William of Normandy. And in his case, it's the Capetian dynasty. His descendants basically stay on the French throne until 1848, but only through cadet branches after 1328, right? Because after that, you get the Valois, you get the Bourbons. So I don't have a tremendous amount to say about him, but I think that he is S tier because he is this kind of founder monarch. He as I say, he's coming from an entrenched West Frankish aristocracy. So his lineage includes a whole bunch of very, very kind of cool figures like these Roberts, who play a very important role in protecting West Francia for those threats that I mentioned before, East Francia and the Vikings. So Hugh is a shoo-in, but because he found such an illustrious dynasty, one of the longest lasting dynasties in European history, I think he has to go in S tier. He's not S tier in spirit. He is another, I would say, William de Normandy type of figure.
What do you think, medieval scholar?
It's hard to deny his influence and impact. Like he said, he didn't rule for very long, but what mattered is what he accomplished while he was ruling, which is something that what he accomplished is something that many rulers don't do when they have decades of time to be leaders. Yeah, so I think, and also, like he said, founding a dynasty that lasts so long is, yeah, the shoes him in for S tier.
All right. Well, you guys both agree S tier then, so I'll reserve any criticism, I suppose. S tier it is. Maximilian.
Ah, I love him. It's hard to talk about everything that he's done because he has such an expansive and well documented life. Uh, he kind of sneaks into this list because even though this is Middle Ages and Maximilian's rule kind of hovers between the Middle Ages and the early modern period, uh, but I will include him anyways because I consider the Middle Ages to end around 1500. He's born in 1459. Um, His father is Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III. His mother is Eleanor of Portugal. When Maximilian is only, I believe, 8 years old, his mom dies at 32. So this tragic loss and being raised by his father only causes Maximilian to go into a direction where he pursues the life of a warrior. Uh, he wants to not so much abandon it, but he focuses less on being a politician and wants to be a knight, wants to be a warrior, wants to be a soldier, and his father is essentially all for it. As, however, Maximilian gets older, he becomes more obsessive about it. He becomes obsessed. He has an intense passion with chivalric contests. He loves jousting. He loves dueling. He loves anything related to martial prowess. He also indulges heavily in wine, women, and feasting. He's a big party animal, but uh, he also is the center of attention to everyone around him for his chivalric nature, even at such a young age. And also his contemporaries say that he was now granted he was a ruler, so they have to say nice things about him, but they said that he's the most handsome man that they have ever seen in their life. So in 1476, when he was 17, Maximilian gets his first experience on a battlefield when he leads a campaign against Hungary in the name of his father. And then he marries Mary of Burgundy, 1477, 1 year later. His biggest victory, or at least the victory that gets him a lot of fame in his early life, is I hope I pronounce it right, is the Battle of either Guingate or Gwingate in 1479 against the French. He actually, a cool little tidbit, the Burgundian pikemen that serve in his army are the precursors to the famed Landsknecht mercenaries. So as Maximilian gets older, he gains a lot of fame from his victory against the French, but he hurts himself as a ruler by trying to centralize his own authority and going against traditional rights of the people. His later successes as an imperial ruler, unfortunately, according to historians, they say that he was not able to compensate for his mistakes when he was regent, but he was able to, even though he pursued a life of war, he was able to be also a politician, signing multiple treaties, one such as the Treaty of Arras with Louis the XI. This, unfortunately, this was between the French and the Netherlander provinces in the Low Countries. So this 10-year period in 1482 to the 1490s, they rebel twice against him. The Flemish capture Maximilian, but on intervention of his father, they release him. He was elected king of the Romans in 1486 in Aachen. He recaptures Austria and endeavors and incursions into Hungary. He enters Vienna without a siege. He's injured during battle, attacking the citadel of the city, which was protected by 400 Hungarian soldiers, who, after an intense fight, eventually they surrendered. He recaptured much of Austria for his father and for the throne that was taken from their enemies. He explored various types of military models for while he was in the Low Countries, which is like modern day Netherlands and those surrounding regions. Urban militias, vassal troops, French military companies, as well as German mercenaries. He had a class-based mentality. He was very aristocratic. He wanted favor towards the aristocracy and nobles. He promoted those who were very loyal to him, and some who rebelled against him were punished with death, but he preferred to not execute people and instead confiscate their lands. He has a campaign against Hungary and Italy, which doesn't go as well. I wish I had more. I could talk about Maximilian for an hour because I
Sounds
think
like it.
No,
Yeah.
that's good.
That's
Where,
very
where, do you wanna,
comprehensive.
where are you going to rank them?
Maximilian could go on for an hour because there's so
Yeah.
much that goes into why he is ranked.
He sounds great. Maybe it's because he's coming at a time that is much more literate. You got the printing press. Even before the printing press, literacy rates were going up and up and up in Europe. The Holy Roman Emperors were issuing more and more correspondence. But he is just, everybody.
He's also a
from, like,
Habsburg.
He's a Habsburg. Everybody from like primary sources to secondary sources today, historians today, are just like in love with
They
this
rave
guy. It
about
sounds
him.
like they rave
Yeah.
about this guy.
He's
So there's
known.
clearly something to him.
He's known posthumously as the last knight of Europe.
Well, you got to do the German. Der letzte Ritter.
Yeah.
Somebody do it better than me, please. Der letzte Ritter.
The
Right.
last knight of
He's,
Bayard
the
would
last-
like a word.
The last
yeah.
rider. But then he's also
in
he's
spirit,
a Don Quixote, right?
Yeah,
but
in
then he's also
spirit,
very
he's the last
Machiavellian.
knight. In spirit, he's the last knight. Bayard would probably want a word with that. But Maximilian is depending on who you ask. If you're asking a peasant, then maybe not. But if you're asking a noble aristocrat, then they will go on for hours on why they love him. He was a great soldier. He's a great military leader, which you could argue also ended up being his downfall because he just pursued so many military campaigns that didn't go in his favor, especially against the Italians. But he introduced so much reform, for better or for worse. He had a great impact on the Holy Roman Empire. As you also said, David, even modern day historians and contemporaries, they rave about him. I'll start off by putting him in A, and you guys can debate about it.
Go ahead,
He
David.
might be S tier in terms of propaganda ability. He sounds like one of the great propagandists of all time, as far as the Holy Roman Empire, right? Like this is, And so there's talk of his image building program, right? And clearly it worked.
There's even a style of armor that exists now solely named after him. When people look at the very fancy, fluted Gothic type of armor, it's Maximilian style.
Yeah. Wow.
I mean, look at you could go on Google and look at the Met, or you could look at the Imperial Treasury in Vienna, and the pieces of Maximilian style armor that they have is absolutely incredible. The craftsmanship, but he, as a military leader and pursuing it from such a young age, like you said, Mike, when in regards to Henry VI, how you have a soft spot for him for growing up without a father. In this regard, Maximilian grew up without a mother. And I mean, even doing that today is incredibly difficult. Doing it in the 15th century, I can't imagine how difficult it is, even if you're royalty. So for his accomplishments, I will argue that he's S, but in fairness, he might be A. So
it sounds like he's definitely S in character in terms of
yeah,
this very impressive guy. Like, he is the life of the party in
life
many
of the party.
ways.
He's a soldier.
And
He's infatuated with art
S tier in
and
spirit.
music. Yeah, he's S tier in spirit. I think he goes A.
But he's like high A, right? Like, is he
High
second?
A.
Is he first? Is he second?
I think he's below Alfred.
Yeah.
He might be above Alfred depending on who you talk to. I'll put him below Alfred.
Just
Wait.
Alfred.
So what I'm not picking up on though is like what's sort of his like lasting, because we can look at guys like Alfred or Philip or Alexios in particular and say, okay, this was their lasting legacy. Like the next generation did XYZ because of him. So like what's Maximilian's?
Just like Habsburg's on top, right?
I mean, hashtag Habsburg Nation. Edward, Edward Habsburg, if you watch this, Team Habsburg.
You will now. We will have.
But so here I'll quickly go over 4 things notable, like reforms that Maximilian did. So Maximilian sought to expand the authority of the imperial diet of the empire, which was the representative assembly, and sought to centralize power through them. He attempted to establish peace and order in the empire through the Landfrieden, which means public peace decrees, aiming to eliminate private warfare and maintain stability in the imperial territories of the empire. He had numerous judicial reforms aimed at improving the administration of justice. Like I said earlier, he often opted to take away lands, take away money, take away various titles and other things of people rather than executing them. He included establishment of imperial courts and codification of laws to ensure uniformity and fairness in legal proceedings. And lastly, he attempted to establish a permanent council called the Reich Regiment that would have centralized authority over the empire. Although this reform, it wasn't fully successful during his time as emperor, but it did lay the foundation for later attempts of other emperors after him to centralize power.
I mean, this is, yes, my contention with S, but it's not a serious contention. It's just that, like, what an age that is jam-packed with amazing rulers. He's followed by Charles V.
Which is incredible in his own right.
The emperor of the empire on which the sun never sets. And then Ferdinand for the HRE after him, and then Philip II, who is just very impressive guy too. I read a biography on him by Geoffrey Parker. Really great book. Absolute workaholic, but just swamped with correspondence in a very literate age, trying to manage all of Spain's, Portugal's colonial possessions, tries to take over England, right? Elizabeth puts a stop to that. But like, what a jam-packed age. Mm-hmm. Crazy. Generational run.
Yeah, if my summary of Maximilian can nowhere do justice to him. If you're interested, you can go and read countless accounts and biographies of him. He's an incredible figure.
Sounds like a Maximilian thread is coming soon.
I
So
already have one. I should repost it after this is recorded.
So where do you guys
I
want
wanna
to put
read that.
him?
I would put him high A.
Yeah, like second or first. Oh, you plopped him in S?
Yeah, I'm not as a
Let me see
as
that.
a Habsburg
Hold on now.
propagandist. I wouldn't have complained about that. I think second place A is perfect for him.
All right. Yeah, you're right about the generational age. And it's really interesting to think about how the one figure who everybody talks about from that time is Henry VIII. And he's like the biggest doofus from that time.
Yeah,
Whereas,
Yeah.
like
they
all these
Yeah.
talk
other
about
guys,
him.
Francis or
He won a
Charles
few
V,
jousts.
or
He won a few jousts and then got fat, and he
yeah,
divorced a bunch of his
Yeah,
wives.
just
he's
go
the William the Conqueror of his time.
Yeah,
just
but
go
he
look
did.
at
So he
the
did what? He did build up. Okay, this is a tangent now, but he did build up England's navy, right?
He built
He-
up the Navy. Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, and then he blew through all the money though. That his dad left him a surplus, and he blew
Yeah.
through it all.
And then the Church in England incident because he wanted to
Well,
get a
yeah, there's
divorce
that.
and the church wouldn't let him. And then
That's
he
the biggest thing.
destroyed all the monasteries and all the
Yeah, looted
other
them,
priories and looted them across the
nationalized them, basically.
kingdom. Yeah,
All right, sorry.
it's
Not
awful.
trying to derail our
Okay,
project here.
okay.
Sorry, I apologize.
Yeah.
Maybe we
do you
need
guys?
kings
You opened a
in
can of
early
worms.
modernity. We need kings in early modernity too. That'd be fun.
Yeah, we should do that one too. I mean,
Yeah.
I feel like this format it's just a lot of fun because you can kind of learn about other things from other people. You can kind of discuss it a little bit, and you get sort of like a view of a lot of things. And then considering the rankings also sort of brings up these interesting conversational points. So I think it's just a really engaging format overall.
Mhm.
Baldwin the Fourth. So Baldwin the Fourth, he I don't have the years exactly, but it's roughly in the 1160s, if I recall. His father dies. He's 13 years old when he is crowned king. Now, his tutor at the time is William of Tyre, the famous chronicler and clergyman, bishop, something in the church. I forget exactly his rank, but anyway, William the Tyre is his educator and tutor. And William notices that when Baldwin is playing with the other kids are pinching him or he's falling down, and the pain is not registering with him. Basically, he's like taking it like an absolute champ. And he is starting to become suspicious that Baldwin has leprosy because one of the early signs is that you start to develop numbness or nerve damage. So the kingdom is sort of aware of this, and my understanding is that the High Council of the Kingdom of Jerusalem is sort of aware, but at the time that he's crowned king at 13 years old, there's not a lot of signs of it, so they think maybe it will blow over. And the other problem is that the other nobles who would be considered to potentially become king are all sort of significantly unsuitable in their own ways. And so, for the decision of the High Council of the time, they felt like crowning Baldwin as king, maybe the leprosy is not serious, maybe it blows over because there's not a lot of signs. And the other candidates are, to be honest, quite bad. So he's crowned king at 13 with Raymond III of Tripoli as his regent. Basically, he becomes king in his own right at 15, but probably speculation, I suppose, is that due to puberty, the onset of the leprosy becomes much more exacerbated. And even in his later stages of military training, he starts to lose the feeling in his legs. I'm sorry, he loses the feeling in one of his hands, not his legs, to where he actually has to learn to ride horseback by guiding the horse with his knees because he doesn't have feeling in one of his hands at that point. Anyway, at 16, then, so as soon as he becomes king, he has discovered in his time as ruling with the regency of Raymond that the Council of Nobles is really pacifying Saladin and sort of letting him expand and get comfortable. And he realizes that that's not really going to be good for the interests of the kingdom of Jerusalem. So as soon as he becomes king at 15, he tries to essentially he starts actually working with the Byzantines, with Manuel, the emperor at that time, who is Alexios's grandson, if I recall correctly, and trying to initiate a giant offensive against Saladin, which sort of falls by the wayside due to the disparate opinions of the various nobles. That sort of falls through. However, in the following year, he does attempt to go start taking something back from Saladin, and runs into him outside of Montgisard. The Crusader force under Baldwin is pretty small, so they retire to the nearby castle, and Saladin sort of figures that he's just going to be able to sort of retire, go away, whatever. And some Templars come and join Baldwin. They go out immediately. Baldwin sort of famously dismounts, prays in front of the standard of the cross, and they just make this monumentous charge at Saladin, routing him, and Saladin narrowly escapes being killed or captured himself. A total Kingdom of Jerusalem victory. And this was a theme that would play out over the course of Baldwin's short reign. He only reigned for 8 years, if I recall. But he did take the fight to Saladin. He won a couple other military victories against him, some smaller ones, not as famous as at Montgisard, and basically spent the rest of his reign really trying to get outside support to help the Kingdom of Jerusalem, because he could see the coalescing forces of Saladin and his rising power. But because of the bickering of the nobility, he was undermined in a lot of ways. And then also, due to the way that leprosy was, himself having an heir would have sort of been untenable, because leprosy at the time, it was either viewed as God's judgment upon you for some sort of wickedness, or it was viewed as being transmitted as an STD. So for him to have an heir would have it would have been sort of legitimately untenable for the noble class. So he needed to look elsewhere for an heir. So he originally was trying to marry his sister, which is where Guy of Lusignan comes in. And unfortunately, Guy's rise to power, which clashes with a lot of the rest of the nobility, sort of further complicating those problems that he was having already, sort of coincides with Baldwin's declining health. And so Baldwin is sort of unable to wrap up due to, I would say, the difficulties with the nobility, and then sort of the lack of material support that ends up coming from outside. He's sort of really unable to completely shore up the kingdom and the succession before his unfortunate death to leprosy. Although what I think makes Baldwin so incredible is his, I guess we would say, S tier in spirit, his ability to just really persevere in the face of this absolutely crippling illness, where he's losing the functions of his body, but he still is riding into battle with various parts of his body being numb. In one of the battles, actually, he's unhorsed and has to be dragged away because he's not even able to mount his horse on his own. And in the last couple of years of his reign, he's unable to walk unassisted. And actually, unlike the picture that I have here, he actually doesn't wear a mask. So he is very disfigured looking later in his reign, which is sort of a source of shame for him, and the Muslims don't like it in particular. They find it to be rather crude, I suppose, or disturbing. But he just extremely heroic in the face of this crippling illness, which, you read about, like, it keeps saying, oh, he goes blind. Leprosy made him blind. But what actually happens is that the leprosy is so affecting his face that his eyelids don't blink anymore. And so his eyes basically just dry out. And still in the face of this, he's trying to, wrap up the secession, get the nobles on the same page, rally support, and basically just goes to the very end. So, he's not monumental. He's not incredibly revolutionary, but I think he's extremely heroic. So I'm going to put him just a little bit above Baldwin I, and I will let you guys hash it out.
Baldwin. That's good to me.
Oh, maybe so.
As you said, like, incredibly heroic figure. You think about the pains of ruling a kingdom paired with the pains of leprosy, the horrifying disease. definitely S tier in spirit.
Yeah. I can't imagine the level of inspiration that his soldiers may have felt during battle to see their king, despite being ravaged by such a horrible illness, to the point that I think contemporary accounts at Montgisard say that he also, because of the loss of feeling in his arm and hand and things like that, he also fought with one hand. Um, Seeing your king suffer from such an awful uh, disease and ailment, and yet continue to fight on the front lines with you to show honor and courage in the face of your enemies that are threatening the livelihood of you and your kingdom. Fight, riding his horse, controlling it with his knees, fighting and using a sword with one hand, just off of the level of courage and inspiration that he gave to his subjects and his men, uh, puts him in B tier. He is in that lull period between the Second Crusade and the Third Crusade, so there isn't a terrible lot of things going on for him to encounter and deal with. Um, but for what he's given, for the cards that he is dealt in his life, because he is dealt a horrible hand, he makes the most of it. He makes the most of it. Many people today would not be able to do the things that Baldwin did under his circumstances. So yeah, I think he's very comfortable in B tier.
And of course, he's in a big Hollywood epic.
Yeah, he's one of those literally me characters.
Yeah, there was a whole trend about Baldwin, right? And they just
Yeah,
extracted because
Baldwin posting and all that stuff.
the movie is, we know the movie, but
Yeah.
they extracted the Baldwin bits, right? And he has the chess scene. The chess scene is brilliant, right?
The chess scene is great.
Your soul is in your keeping alone.
Your soul is your keeping alone. Also, him and like Saladin respects him as a ruler, as a warrior. Saladin has a respect for Baldwin, despite nearly killing him at Montgisard when he narrowly escaped on the back of a camel. But yeah, obviously the mask is rule of cool. There's no contemporary evidence to support that he wore a mask at all. Yeah, I mean it's cool, but I believe now sources can differ. I believe a lot of the disfigurement that he suffered for much of his life was was the loss of his eyesight, like you mentioned, and also on his hands and his arms. I believe for a very long time his face was not as disfigured as other people with leprosy were. Now that could be because of any possible treatments that they were giving him at the time. I have no idea. Maybe he just got lucky for a little bit, but
yeah, that may be so. I think some of the later sources, particularly the Muslim sources, writing about how when they visited Jerusalem in the late 11 or early 1180s, which was he died in 83. I'm sorry, 85, and 83 is when he went blind. So if I recall, one of the sources writing in that time mentioned that he was so disfigured that he basically kept out of public. So
it must have been maybe just earlier. He couldn't mount a horse anymore. He couldn't walk or use his hands, right?
He couldn't walk unassisted. He was blind. Yeah, couldn't. Yeah. He basically couldn't use his hands or feet, and still he was, riding around on being basically carried on litters. There's the incident where he basically rides to go. He's carried on the horses outside of the gates of Tyre, I think it was, where Guy was holed up because he was trying basically to get Guy out of the picture once he realized he had made a huge mistake. Or that Guy turned out to be a mistake, one or the other.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't have a lot. That's kind of the problem, is he didn't have a lot of options. I know he was, just sort of speaking casually, he was sort of shopping around his sister to try to get that, the secession situation stabilized. and Guy ended up at the time being the best option. But he sort of realized that that was going to be a huge problem, especially after he was clashing with the rest of the nobles. So I think really he did, like you said, he was dealt a very bad hand with the leprosy, and I feel like just if he was totally S tier in spirit, and I think it's one of those great what ifs that if he had lived, could he have effectively combated Saladin, rallied
Hmm.
support from the West, maybe shored up the kingdom, that sort of thing, because his death, unfortunately, and then Guy really, and then the Battle of Hattin is really just a disaster
Catastrophe.
for the kingdom, basically.
Yeah.
So it's sort of one of those great what ifs, because certainly he seems like a preeminent heroic figure that
Hmm.
just, had leprosy, unfortunately. All right, Justinian.
Okay, Justinian. So he is the Byzantine emperor from 527 to 565. He's born in the Balkans to a peasant family. He's of Illyro-Roman origin, meaning he's a Latin speaker, basically the last. Then the Byzantine Empire becomes more and more Greek. And I mean, you know this name. Everything with Justinian is absolutely titanic. From his dynasty's very rags to riches story, to his victories, to his setbacks, to his legacy. This is a titanic figure. Um, so he was fortunate enough to have. He wasn't really a military leader himself. He was fortunate enough to have very good generals, particularly in the form of Belisarius, but then also others like the eunuch Narses. He's able to reconquer North Africa. He's able to reconquer Italy. He is on the cusp of a restoration of the Roman Empire, but then he's struck by literally a biblical series of calamities. So everything from earthquakes to bubonic plague to famines. There's a little ice age. There's volcanoes. Like
Yeah.
the on one hand, he was fortunate for a number of reasons. He inherited the surplus. He had this amazing martial talent around him. On the other hand, he was incredibly unlucky because of, I guess, this little ice age, which set all these calamities into motion. Um, Ultimately, he does recover from those. He does set the empire on a path to recovery, but there was just no way for his successors to hold on to his territorial gains, which bankrupt the empire, or almost bankrupt the empire, despite the fact that, as I say, he inherited a surplus. Um, all that said, right, you can say, well, ultimately, I think um, I think he did more bad than good. This is a reasonable argument. In fact, a top Byzantinist he gave a top 10 Byzantine emperor list. Justinian doesn't even make it on there, but obviously the, the folks online had a lot to say about that, because at the end of the day, this is the guy who gives us the Hagia Sophia, which is far and away the grandest church in Christendom. When he enters it, he is supposed to have muttered under his breath, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." And with good reason. I mean, this was truly an architectural feat. And then the other big thing is he codifies and promulgates Roman law. And this trickles into the Latin West, up through Italy, over the Alps by the time of Barbarossa. And so, in a nutshell, the Justinianic Code is the reason the West rediscovers Roman law. And this is why I think you have to give him S tier, despite the fact that Justinian himself, as far as his character goes, this could be a whole separate conversation. He's an almost Stalin-like figure. He's always in his palace. Obviously, there's a moment where he kills tens of thousands because of riots, the Nika riots, in the Hippodrome. And he's always issuing his orders through his cronies. He's enormously intelligent, but enormously paranoid, but also enormously effective, but also enormously ruthless. So his legacy is more than tinged with tragedy. Some of it his doing, some of it not. But as I say, he is a titanic figure.
Where do you want to put
Yeah.
him?
I think he's S tier, like no question about it. What I'm debating in my mind is he second? I think that. So this then goes to a question about how do we want to treat the S tier? Do we want to treat it as, if it's in terms of pure consequence, he is second. If it's in terms of positive consequences, he might be a little bit lower down, because he arguably sets the Byzantine Empire up for a little bit of a walloping in the succeeding century, especially as the Muslims come around and take over the Sassanids. So I'm a little bit torn. You put him in third place there. I guess if we're treating the S tier as like positive contributions, then I would put him third or fourth maybe.
Yeah, I think greatness sort of implies a positivity.
Yeah.
I think
Certainly
third
for your
place,
own
yes.
people at least.
Yeah.
We just won't talk about the Justinian plague.
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
the outbreak of bubonic plague called Justinian plague. I mean, again, he partly had a bad hand dealt to him, but he also had some of it to do himself. I mean, some of the his negative legacy has to just do with this ill-fated reconquest restoration effort, right? He almost bankrupts the empire. But again, he then, a lot of that money is also spent on the Hagia Sophia. And so he's definitely S tier, probably in the middle of S tier.
What do you think, Medieval Scholar?
I think that's a fair spot.
All right. Fair spot. So next up we have Edward IV.
Okay, so Edward he inherits the Yorkist claim to the throne from his father, Richard, Duke of York. Richard was killed at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460. Now, Edward, I love him because of the circumstances that are given to him when he takes power. He was a formidable military leader. I did do a thread like a week and a half ago about why I believe that he was underrated and his exceptional military victories, and many of which he was fighting on the front lines, leading his soldiers and inspiring them at a young age. I believe at the Battle of Towton, he was only 18. He won the Battle of Northampton. He won the Battle of Mortimer's Cross. He won the Battle of Towton, which is the bloodiest battle on English soil. An absolute slaughter. And I'll talk specifically about Towton. There's countless other battles that Edward fought in and won, but Towton is his most important. So Edward declares himself King Edward IV, and leading up to Towton, and it's on March 29th, 1461. The battle happens. An estimated around 50,000 soldiers engage each other in the weather's terrible. On Palm Sunday, amid a snowstorm, the Lancastrians try to fire arrows at the Yorkist forces. The wind is going against the Lancastrian archers, so the arrows fall short. And the Yorkists, funnily enough, they pick up the Lancastrian arrows and they shoot them back at them. So the Lancastrians go, okay, well, this is a complete waste of time. There's nothing that we can do. So we have no choice but to charge the Yorkists. And what they do is they slam into the Yorkist left flank by Castle Wood. And the 18-year-old King Edward responds to this by moving to reinforce the left flank. He fights on the front lines and inspires his men to stay and fight with him as he continues to fight himself. Eventually, later on into Towton, the Duke of Norfolk arrives with reinforcements, and those forces are inspired by both the Duke of Norfolk and by Edward IV's actions. They rout the Lancastrians. The Lancastrians try to retreat, and they suffer horrifically heavy casualties. So badly to the point that many people claim that the rivers nearby Towton ran red with the blood of the Lancastrians for days, even after the battle. The battle weakened the House of Lancaster. Henry VI fled the country. Edward IV uses this to ascend to the throne of England. He wins Losecoat Field. He wins the Battle of Barnet, which is a huge victory. This results in the death of one of the most important people in English history, which is Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, also known as the Kingmaker. He's killed in battle. He attempts to retreat from the Battle of Barnet. He's pursued by the Yorkist forces, and he's thrown from his horse, and he's inevitably killed. He also wins at Tewkesbury, and Edward inevitably dies. He's succeeded, of course, by a good fellow later down in this list. But a lot of why I rate Edward so highly is because of his military prowess, his military record. As far as I know, every battle he took part in, he did not lose. Young age, he inherited the cause in one of the worst civil war conflicts in English history, and he handled it nearly as well as he could. Obviously, he didn't live to see the end of the Wars of the Roses, but he did what he could to attempt to bring the victory of the conflict for the Yorkists. So Edward, I think, is a underrated king. He's overshadowed by predecessors and successors. I think he deserves more recognition for, obviously, like I said, his military leadership. So I would say he isn't a generation definer, but I think it's fair to put him starting before the debate. We'll put him in B tier.
What do you think, David?
I have no qualms with that. Yeah. I don't know a tremendous deal about him, but if you were to sum it up, like, he's B tier because he is still indispensable. History would have proceeded differently without him, correct?
Yes. He inherited the Yorkist cause. Every battle that he took part in, they didn't lose. Towton ends up the way it happens because of Edward and his leadership. A lot of the strategy came from Edward and the people that he chose to surround himself with. So given, just like how we were talking about with Justinian, with Baldwin, Edward is given a bad hand by taking the Duke of York's cause upon his death at Wakefield, but I think he does as best as he can with it. So I think putting him in B is pretty fair. As to where he goes, I'm not sure.
Would the 100 Years' War have continued or been restarted without him, since there were those tensions with France, and then he gets assuaged, and then it ultimately does not continue, correct?
Well, Edward, so the 100 Years' War is already over.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Edward dies in 1483 at 40.
This is the War of the Roses.
Yeah, this is Wars of the Roses. 100 Years' War ends in 1453 after Castillon.
Yeah, I'm just seeing from some cursory knowledge that he apparently considered restarting the 100 Years' War, but ultimately he decides not to. And then
he chooses not to.
Picquigny.
Yeah, with Louis the 11th.
Yes,
that's right. Yeah, that's the formal.
Sorry,
end.
I misunderstood you.
Yeah, no, he is right. The treaty that he signs with Louis the 11th is for all intents and purposes, the 100 Years' War ends after the English defeat at Castillon in 1453. But the treaty that he signs in 1475, or not 14, the treaty that he signs with Louis the 11th is the formal end of the 100 Years' War.
Yeah, got it.
So I would say I would put Edward above Baldwin, but below Frederick.
So I think I'm actually glad that you included Edward and Richard because I think they both deserve certainly more attention.
Hmm.
Um, and I do think this period of history is super interesting. My issue with my issue with Edward moving him up above the Baldwins is going to be that I do agree with you that militarily he did the best that he could. My issue with him was his foolish mistake to marry the girl who then isolated or made an enemy basically out of the kingmaker.
Yeah,
Well, he
Richard
was
Neville
in
definitely
he was
was
in France.
enraged.
Yeah, because he was in France negotiating a different marriage for Edward when
Yeah,
Edward decided to marry, I forget what her name was. So I
Elizabeth Woodville, I believe, was her name.
yeah, and so I don't really part of the problem. I mean, he might have things might have turned differently if he hadn't have made an enemy out of the kingmaker. So I think that's a real
It's definitely a blow to his legacy, I would say.
a real slip up, if you
The
will.
Wars of the Roses probably could have ended up differently, perhaps, but another big what if.
And I think so. Um, I in I think with the both of the Baldwins, they both inherited tough situations and both improved the circumstances from where they were at. And Edward's circumstance to me seems to be about level.
Mhm.
Like by not that he didn't, obviously he's a fantastic commander, um, but it seems like his situation was basic. Like the war wasn't really like any closer to being ended after he was dead, and Richard III takes it up than not, right? Or am I misreading that?
The Yorkists are definitely looking at a potential end to the war, uh, but obviously Richard III, Edward. If I believe if Edward had survived, if he did not die at 40, then I believe that the Yorkists would have succeeded in the war. But it's just another what if. He dies. Richard
Sure.
III. Richard III takes it up. Uh, Bosworth Field happens the way that it does, and thus the Lancastrians win, and Henry Tudor becomes king. So
All right. So you think above the Baldwins. I think below the Baldwins.
we'll
Leave it
leave
up to
David
you,
to
David.
tiebreak.
I think his portrait is a point against him. I'm gonna link this in chat here. I don't know if you guys can see his
he
portrait.
suffers he
He's very
suffers the
funny
fate
looking.
of facing right.
No, but you can see he's just an ill-proportioned individual. His head is way too big. His portrait is like he looks
That guy.
minuscule.
He can't. This is a guy that can't even fight back. He's been dead for like
Yeah,
500 years. He can't even defend himself.
but it is what it is, right?
Yeah.
When you see these portraits of Edward and Richard, it makes you really appreciate like the significance of Holbein.
Yeah.
Yeah. Looking at this list, it makes me incredibly sad to know that how many of these guys don't have movies or shows or anything depicting them. Like Maximilian has a show. It's a good one. It's in French, but
Oh, really?
subtitles are fine. Um, but like someone like Edward, I believe absolutely deserves one, or at least like a mini series depicting his.
That's called Game of Thrones.
Ew.
Yeah. Yeah. It is
All
basically
right.
War of the Roses, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Wars of the Roses is heavily inspired.
And a bit
You
of
know,
Byzantine history.
Lannister, Lancaster, Stark,
Yeah.
York. The Starks are white. The Lannisters are red. It's a heavy inspiration for George.
And the shape of
Also,
Westeros, right? The
also a
Yeah.
likeness
heavy
and stuff.
inspiration on Final Fantasy Tactics. If you guys ever played
Hmm.
that.
I have not.
Isn't the map of Westeros, or at least the Seven Kingdoms, isn't the map of Westeros just Ireland on top of England?
Yeah,
It's like flipped upside down. Yeah.
basically. Yeah.
Interesting. All right. So what do you think, David?
Um, is he behind the Baldwins? I think he's before them, though.
All right.
I think he's before them. I think he's more consequential for England than the. not necessarily the Baldwins were for Jerusalem, but ultimately England
I
would
think it's very
become what it
close.
is. Yeah. Yeah. I think he was more consequential historically, not necessarily respectively for England, if that makes sense. Like the Baldwins are incredibly important for Jerusalem, but um, I think given that he is the King of England, he deserves a higher up place on the list.
And he has to fight for it too.
Yeah.
So did the Baldwins. But that's fair. That's fair. We'll leave him. We'll put him there. All right. So Robert the Bruce.
The Bruce.
That's right. All right. So everyone's seen Braveheart. There you go.
There you go.
Oh, glad we got that out of the way.
Yeah.
And
All right.
his father had leprosy, right?
We've all seen Outlaw King on Netflix.
And Braveheart, right?
Yeah, and Braveheart. Yeah. Did he in real life though? I didn't actually.
I don't think he did. I think it's a
I have
fiction.
no idea.
Interesting.
It's any man's game trying to find out what's fact or fiction in Braveheart. Outlaw King is a great movie though. If you haven't seen it, if you want to see something about Robert the Bruce.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to think about how Braveheart is not a bad movie, but like some of those inaccuracies and then how he's perceived in modern time. I think he certainly still is perceived as he was in Braveheart, but that was not how he was obviously in real life. I think.
Maybe you can play the role that channel history buffs. Like, what was his actual relation to William Wallace?
Reading about it, I'm not sure that they had much of a relationship at all that I can tell.
Right.
William Wallace, sort of the origins of the conflict, it was William Wallace and Andrew, I can't think of his name, but it was the two of them basically who had their famous victory at Stirling Bridge.
Yeah.
And
which there's no bridge in the movie. They got rid of the bridge.
Right. Yeah. No bridge. Well, I think they
Battle
basically
of Stirling Bridge, no bridge.
Yeah, they turned. I think that battle was supposed to be Loudon Hill, or the way that it was portrayed was basically like the Battle of Loudon Hill, kind of with the spears in the front and everything.
Right. But then Stirling Bridge, it was swampy. There's a bridge, and the English cavalry attack goes disastrously. Right.
Many such cases.
They caught. I think they caught them trying to cross the bridge originally. They caught them basically halfway across the bridge, which was how they sort of were able to cut them up because the army was still crossing. But in any case, Robert the Bruce, he basically, everybody kind of knows he has to fight for his crown, and he's up against England. And he basically faces, after the initial conflict in which William Wallace is killed and the other one, Andrew, that's going to haunt me. Anyway, after the two of them are...
Is that a title? Bishop of St. Andrews? Or no? Is this a rival to him or an ally?
No. This was they were working together. William and the other guy, I forget his name.
It will appear on screen, folks. Maybe.
Yeah, I'll have to. Andrew Moray.
Okay.
So yeah, Stirling. So the Battle of Stirling Bridge the army was led jointly by William Wallace and Andrew Moray. And it's sort of Andrew Moray sort of disappears from the chronicles, if I recall correctly, as well. So he has sort of he's prominent. William Wallace obviously gets captured and executed, and Andrew Moray, who was sort of the other initial leader of the resistance, sort of unceremoniously disappears. And then there's the Battle of Falkirk, which goes poorly for them, which that is shown in the battle or in Braveheart. In any case,
good old hanging, drawing, and quartering, right?
That's right. Yeah. Sending him to the four corners.
Frida, and one of the last. Am I correct in saying that it's kind of was phased out slowly but surely after that? What we're dealing with, like the 14th century by that point. By the time William Wallace dies, was it already seen as kind of particularly brutal by then?
Oh, I don't know.
I think I read that somewhere, but fact check required.
But really, after that point is really where Robert the Bruce's story becomes a lot more epic, because he then sort of takes up, his claim to the Scottish throne, and he faces a series of reversals. After which, then he is essentially driven off of the island of England, if you will, or the whatever Britain, however you want to refer to the island. He's driven off. I believe he goes to Ireland and ends up coming back with his brother, and they wage something of a guerrilla war against the English. The Battle of Loudon Hill was a notable defeat of the English on their behalf. And then they sort of led this guerrilla war that led up to the Battle of Bannockburn, where they really
Mhm.
took this overwhelming English force by surprise.
Yeah.
And in fact, so Robert the Bruce, he was very, for the time, classically educated. It's speculated that he was educated by a knight and several other scholars, because he had a real interest in history and reading history and having history read to him, as well as being trained in a lot of the understanding of chivalry and the martial qualities of previous rulers. And so he was very inspired by that. And which, at the Battle of Bannockburn, allegedly, as the story goes, which it's, of course, debatable whether it happened or not, he opens the battle by engaging in single combat with Henry de Bohun,
Well,
who sees him. Basically, Henry, the English army is riding up as the Scottish army is sort of like in the woods a little bit there at Bannockburn, and Robert the Bruce is sort of out front, giving commands and directing things. And Henry de Bohun feels like he has an opportunity to maybe just end it here, so he charges across the battlefield at Robert the Bruce, who only happens to have his favorite axe on him. And Henry de Bohun lowers his lance, and Robert does a crafty maneuver where he dodges, rises up in his stirrups, and smashes him right in the skull with the axe, basically splitting everything. And basically then just sort of like coolly like rides back to his men, keeps like setting things up,
So,
only stopping
anyways,
only stopping to lament that, like, drat, that was my favorite axe. Because he hits him so hard that the axe handle shatters. Anyway, so they win the Battle of Bannockburn, and then he's able to basically turn the tide on the English and start invading England. And through a series of other encounters, is able to, about 10 years later, sign a peace treaty, an official treaty, with the King of England, establishing the official independence of Scotland, which then obviously it is, I suppose you could say, still independent to this day, technically its own country. So, he goes down in history as sort of the man who established the official independence of Scotland from England. And I don't know if relative to a lot of the other rulers on here, if he's going to have necessarily as many sort of generational accomplishments as that, sort of winning his crown. But I think I might put him. Maybe we'll just start him off right in the middle of B, and I'll sort of let you guys discuss where you think he should go from there.
like very important for Scotland, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that is what it's all about at the end of the day, right? It is a list about leaders and kings, and those leaders and kings rule their kingdom or their country or their empire.
Yeah.
So, this isn't obviously talking about, oh, how did Robert the Bruce affect the history of France? It's not about that. His impact and legacy on Scotland is, I mean, he essentially finished the job in terms of gaining their independence, and especially with, like you said, with the battles of like Loudon Hill and Bannockburn. He It's not much to say about him. I mean, the Battle of Loudon Hill and Bannockburn were, you could argue that they're against all odds victories. I mean, the English forces were always insurmountably larger, more organized, and stronger than the Scots. But the Scots were always able to bring it out and win, like with Loudon Hill, with the ditches and the the spikes against the cavalry, against Prince Edward and uh, Aymer de Valence, the Earl of Pembroke. These are, England wanted to absolutely crush Scotland, to do to Robert the Bruce what they did to William Wallace, to make sure that the seeds of rebellion are destroyed and that this never ever happens again. And Robert the Bruce somehow, against all odds, came out on top and won. So I think for his impact on the history of Scotland, he deserves S tier.
Whoa, S tier.
Yeah,
Wow.
for
That is a jump.
Scotland, I think he deserves S tier.
But then I would just jump to I would jump to Frederick for Sicily, then suddenly becomes super important. And A tier at least. Yes, it's short lived because then the Hohenschaufens are rooted out of Sicily. So a lot gets reversed. But very important for Sicily at that time. I think that with some of these rulers, we've definitely looked at broader impact beyond their respective countries, right? Like the Saint King of France being one example, right? Very important, or at least of greater importance to Christendom at large too, beyond just France. So I think it is an important factor. Like what kingdom you rule, maybe impact outside of that kingdom's broader impact on Christendom, or at least the broader world.
My argument is if William the Conqueror is an S tier for essentially creating the country that we know it as today, then I believe Robert the Bruce should be in S tier right next to William the Conqueror, because he and what he did created Scotland that we know today.
Well, I think maybe the issue with that is going to be that England
swallows it up. Right?
No disrespect to Scotland, obviously, but England sort of becomes an extremely consequential country after the fact, whereas Scotland sort of gets absorbed into that. So, because you have obviously the British Empire, the colonists and so forth that come to America. So I think. I mean, that's a fair argument for Scotland, but I think for the ranking that we have here,
it gets at a deeper question almost. Like we're kind of cleaving to the historiography, right? But you raise a really interesting question, which is that, how much did William the Conqueror have to do with Britain becoming, or England becoming Britain, with James inheriting Scotland and England and then just uniting the crowns and then eventually paving the way for Great Britain? Very little, right? He had something to do with it. He was a feudalizing force. He was a Frenchifying force. Some of that gets reversed later, obviously. But I guess it's a bit of a quandary. Maybe A then? Maybe A is a compromise.
I think A is fair.
All right, I think that's fair. Put him in A.
A valiant defense, medieval poet, medieval scholar.
It was a hard fought battle.
Right. Much like Braveheart ended.
He's epic. Robert the Bruce, I feel like
poets.
In a lot of ways, I feel kind of similarly about him as these other guys like Edward IV or Richard III. I feel like Robert the Bruce is obviously known for his role in Braveheart, but I feel like his actual story is incredibly epic and heroic. The way that he basically has to go underground, very much like Alfred's actually, the way that Alfred is defeated and goes underground and then comes back to be able to win and actually claim the throne and establish his kingdom. It's a very similar type of thing. So Robert the Bruce obviously doesn't, have sort of the scholarly aspect of Alfred, or perhaps in the same way that Alfred is able to set up for England to maintain its own sovereignty. He's not as instrumental for Scotland in that aspect. So maybe A tier is fair, but certainly on the opposite end of Alfred. But he's got a similar aspect to the heroism of his story that I feel like certainly deserves more widespread acclaim.
And his heart gets taken to Jerusalem, right? To the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
I think if I recall, that might be where it ended up. It originally, I believe the Black Douglas took it with him to the Reconquista.
Oh,
And
wow.
then when the Black Douglas died in the Reconquista, it was recovered and then sent back to Scotland, I think,
Wow.
if I recall.
What a journey.
Yeah. All right, so we got Leo III.
Okay, great. So he is Byzantine emperor from 717 to 741. He is your kind of top 10 Byzantine emperors because largely for one act, he single-handedly, or almost single-handedly, saves Constantinople from the Umayyads, which is kind of ironic because one of his nicknames was Leo the Syrian. He knew Arabic, or at least a smattering of Arabic. He was regarded as Saracen-minded, but he was incredibly able, incredibly clever. He organizes this elaborate defense of the Golden Horn. He has garrisons guarding the Bosphorus Strait. But then the main two ingredients of his defense formula are an underwater chain and then the deployment of Greek fire. So basically something similar in composition and effect to modern napalm. The formula for Greek fire still eludes us, but there have been some experiments as to this, as to how to make it. And it crops up during these moments of desperation in Byzantine history. Ultimately, Leo triumphs in this siege. It's the second Arab siege of Constantinople in 718, so right at the start of his reign. And since then, that story, it's gotten retold again and again. For example, George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones. Like, if you remember the Battle of Blackwater, this is clearly ripping from the second Arab siege of Constantinople. Everything from the wildfire being substituted for the Greek fire to the chain, which appears in the books but not the show, and maybe more subtly, the fact that the invader in question, Stannis, is bringing this new faith, this monotheistic evangelizing faith, which stretches from Essos to Westeros, and he's bringing it to this great, great historic city, much like the Umayyads were doing. So I give him either A or S tier. Maybe it's just A, because it's this single act that really makes the man, makes the ruler. But it's an S tier sort of battle. Like it is a Lechfeld. It is it is a Hastings. And besides that, Leo also gets credit for ending a period of anarchy. And then more neutrally, he's also a big iconoclast. What's interesting about that movement, just sort of as a tangent, is that this destruction of icons it seems to have been a response to the traumas inflicted by Muslim expansion. The Muslims seemed indomitable, but then Leo stops them, so that's why he gets a place on this list. I think he goes ultimately like top of A tier somewhere, perhaps third.
Your terms
Right.
are acceptable.
Wow. Okay. All right. Works for me. Last but not least, at least maybe not least, Richard III.
Big Richie, Richard III. So, Richard is not king for very long. He is the last king of the Plantagenet dynasty, and as well as the cadet branch of the House of York. He's the Duke of Gloucester in 1461 after the accession of Edward IV, his brother. Richard is eventually, skipped past the reign of his brother, all that stuff. When Richard is king, he is a controversial reign. People talk about the princes in the Tower of London. It's a theory. It's hard to know for sure what exactly happened. Richard, according to some people who believe it, Richard had them murdered to maintain his legitimacy and maintain that he was the rightful king. So Richard becomes king, and Richard, to assume the throne, he accepts on June 22nd. He's crowned at Westminster Abbey. He declares the sons of Edward to be bastards, that they're not the rightful king, they're not rightful heirs, and so he imprisons them in the Tower of London. And at around when Richard has his coronation, they disappear in 1483. Now, it's hard to know for certain what actually happened to them. They did die. How did they die? Who knows? Who was responsible for it? Who knows? Richard's most notable event is the Battle of Bosworth, which is the ending of the Wars of the Roses. He outnumbers Henry Tudor, meets them at Bosworth Field on August 22nd, I believe, 1485. Excuse me. Richard, I think, is estimated to have had 8,000 men at his command, and Henry had about 5,000. It's not exactly able to know for sure, but is that the most notable thing is Baron Stanley was notoriously known, allegedly, for have abandoning Richard during battle. And Richard famously cries treason before he's struck and killed during the battle. Richard charges, he wants to get the war over with. He wants to make sure that he can maintain his rule of England, maintain his dominion over, in his eyes, the traitor Lancastrians, crush Henry Tudor, this upstart guy that comes and tries to take the crown for himself. He makes, if you look up Graham Turner's painted depiction of the Battle of Bosworth, you see Richard III's charge at Henry Tudor's line. Richard is killed. Obviously, the charge does not work out. Richard dies. Henry Tudor is crowned on the field of Bosworth as King Henry VII, and it leads to the birth of the Tudor dynasty. Funnily enough, it doesn't actually have to, it's just a tidbit that I always found interesting about Richard, is that they found his remains under a parking lot in England.
I think I remember hearing that, yeah.
They found his remains under a parking lot in England in like 2013 or something. Obviously, he's been
consequences of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, he's been reinterred now.
If I recall about that story, there was a lady who kept going to the parking lot a bunch and saying that, like, she thought that Richard was buried below the parking lot or something, and it took her like years of getting people's attention for them to like, oh, we should look, and that's when they dug and found it under there.
And they found a skeleton. They're like, oh wow, yeah. This is like grim. And then they did tests, and they're like, wait, this is King Richard III. And
brilliant.
Yeah, so yeah, he's since been reinterred. Richard obviously doesn't rule long. He doesn't do a ton of things as opposed to people like Alfred or
he rules 2
Otto.
years, right?
Yeah, he only rules for 2 years. He dies at Bosworth.
But it's all in his kind of rise to power, right? He does.
It's all his rise to power. He tries to eliminate people who try to threaten his reign. allegedly killing his nephews. The
Allegedly.
allegedly
Allegedly.
allegedly he had his nephews killed.
And allegedly they found mitochondrial DNA that confirms this.
Oh, it's because I just didn't know a lot about the murders. Is it actually credible evidence that
I think
Richard?
so.
I
Apparently.
wouldn't be surprised. He declared them bastards to remove their legitimacy to the throne. He imprisons them. At that point, I'm not really surprised if he does have them killed. I don't think some random rabble rouser would sneak into the Tower of London and go, "I'm doing you a favor, Richard," and kill his nephews.
No.
Yeah, so I would put
it's
Richard.
in keeping with character, right? This is a very ruthless, and he's kind of spindly, and he's kind of in ill health as well, like Shakespeare
he's
depiction.
He's a little ghoulish.
He had scoliosis.
I believe so. He had the. It's a sad end to the Plantagenets. It's like the Plantagenets going out with a whimper, essentially. When you look at all the kings that are in that dynasty, and then you look at Richard III. But at least he died in somewhat glory in one cavalry charge.
His death is rather heroic, I think.
Yeah, he died a noble warrior and king's death. Granted the things he did, I would put. It's funny to see him at the top of S. He's the supreme king of all the Middle Ages. He's the greatest of all time. In reality, I would probably put him C.
Yeah, that seems fair.
He's not as good of a king as his brother. He's not as good as the Baldwins. He's not better than anyone above him. I would say he's a C.
C, okay. Mm-hmm.
What do you think, David?
Yeah. So it is almost last and least. Almost.
Yeah.
Last and least.
Only because he had an extra year on Godfrey.
Yeah.
He had that extra year that just it put him up over the top.
At least Richard did one or two things as he was king. Godfrey kind of took the.
I don't know. Maybe we should put him below Godfrey, to be honest. I mean, Godfrey didn't lose the War of the Roses.
Much to think about. Yeah, I think bottom of C is a nice safe spot for old Richie.
Okay.
He's let him feel lucky that I chose to put Godfrey.
No, that can't be average. No. Hold on. Ruling for 2 years and losing the War of the Roses. That can't be average.
He died in the losing battle, but he's not the reason that inflamed.
Medieval scholars standing his ground, much
I'm
like Richard did.
I'm standing my ground against.
Yeah.
I'm standing my ground for a guy I don't even like.
Well,
I don't even like Richard III. I mean, I like him for his history.
But I enjoy this period of history, and like I said, I think that he died a heroic death. Certainly credit to him for that. He seemed to have served his brother well when his brother was king. I don't necessarily have any disparaging things to say about him as a person, and certainly he seems rather heroic for his time.
Not for the whole nephew thing.
And except for that, right? But when ranking kings here, if Godfrey's going to go below average for barely ruling at all, only 1 year, and Richard only rules for 2 years and loses the only battle of his kingship, right?
Yeah. He fights in an assortment of battles, but only Bosworth when he's king.
Right. Yeah. So as a king, though, he loses the only battle that he fights as king, and only reigns for 2 years, dies in the battle, and loses the War of the Roses. I mean, that's got to be the worst resume on this list, right?
Also murdering your nephews.
It's not great. It's not a great look. It's
not a good look.
And seeing him next to Otto III actually does insult me a little bit. And lest Otto III gets caught up in these allegations, he did rule for a decade. So a decade versus 2 years.
Get behind me, Otto III. I'll protect you.
I think he's got to go at the bottom. Yeah. I think he's got to go at the bottom.
put him above Godfrey at least.
No,
Whether he did
how?
bad things as king, but he still did things.
Godfrey was a better guy.
Godfrey wasn't even king for a year.
He's a better
He
guy.
lost.
It wasn't even a full
but he
year.
lost.
Yeah,
He lost the War of the Roses.
At least he
lost.
died in battle. Godfrey died on his own, just
True.
died his own, doing his own thing.
Godfrey did not get a heroic death. That's true.
Godfrey deserved one.
Lord
knows.
He didn't get fat
Lord
and
knows.
Godfrey.
Yeah, Lord knows Godfrey
Good
deserved
point.
a heroic death.
Good point. We'll fix that.
Yeah.
All right, I'll let you make the call, David. Where do you think, before or after Godfrey?
I think because he lost, he has to go. He's a loser, so he has to go last. He's a loser.
That's what I'm saying.
I like kings who don't lose. But on a serious note,
to any Richard III fans, I'm very sorry that you have to hear this.
On a serious note, though, like, I'm looking at Justinian, and actually, I've been debating this internally ever since putting him third. Like, he might be second. Like Otto the Great versus Justinian. Justinian revives the study of Roman law, right? Which I know we said we have to look at the respective countries. If we want to really stick by that, then we'd put him third. But if we look at the broader impact that he has on the Latin West, because, okay, now they get Roman law, much of which would have been lost without him, then I think he goes second. I think he is he's a hard hitter. He might even be in an S+ tier like Charlemagne. These two are just like huge. So that's my last 2 cents there about it.
That's fine. Yeah, we'll put him at. I don't. Do you have any problem with that, medieval scholar?
I do not. No.
No.
All right. So we'll call the list. We'll call the list final there, and then as a quick wrap up, which I can either go first or last, I suppose, depending on what you guys want. But maybe if there's any comment that you have about the list, because we arrived on this list with some form of consensus. I'm not saying everybody agreed about everything, obviously, but I figure everyone can maybe have have one final word about somebody who maybe they think was a little too high, or maybe somebody who they think was a little too low. If there was one thing that you think maybe that you would personally change about the list. If one of you guys wants to take that, you could take it, or I'll jump in first, I guess.
I'm pretty happy with it. I guess my big surprise is that Louis IX is so high, but I've heard the arguments out. I do still think that he should be lower in the S tier list, like maybe last on S tier, like just barely clinging on to S tier, like especially because Alfred the Great and then Leo III are in A. And these guys really, again, what I'll stress about them is like history could have unfolded very differently without them. So without Alfred, you might have multiple Englands, which is what you did have. You had Wessex and Jorvik, and you had the Danelaw, and you had Mercia and all these other ones. And he kind of is a unifying force. And then Leo III, I mean, without him, Constantinople could have gotten taken. So we wouldn't be, it could have been 1453. In the 8th century. So, the fact that they're an A tier, history would have unfolded very differently without them. Very consequential rulers.
What do you think, medieval scholar?
You know what they talk about when they refer to like Catholic guilt? I would feel very guilty as a Catholic to not put the Saint King of France and the discoverer of the crown of thorns anywhere below S tier.
Oh yeah. But sorry, do you have any thoughts of your own about the list? Anybody who's too high or too low, do you think?
No, I'm actually very satisfied with the list, even though maybe I would fight for maybe another 6 hours to keep Henry a little higher on A tier, but for what it's worth, for the entire list, I would say it's a good list.
It's a good list.
All right, and I guess I'll wrap it up. I think maybe the end of S tier maybe should have gone to A tier. I think maybe William and Hugh. I understand the arguments for them, but I feel like maybe even at Louis IX, maybe those three, putting those three in the same tier as the other three seems maybe a little bit. The front three of the S tier seem a little bit, just a little bit more top tier, if you
Yeah,
will, than the
S
back
plus,
of the S tier.
S plus.
Um,
And it looks like the reviews are in. We have 25,000 poop emojis, 60,000 grins, we have 20,000 hard eyes. Brilliant.
yeah,
That's
The reviews are in. And we're setting some
that's coming from
records.
25,000 Richard III fans.
yeah. All right. Well, thanks very much for joining me today, gentlemen. For anyone else who's still watching, you can check out both of their links in the description for the Empire Builders here on YouTube and Medieval Scholar on Twitter. Thanks for watching, and let us know in the comments what you think about the ranking.
Yeah, it's fun
Um,
to